Not everything in America's national parks appears on maps. Some creatures belong to folklore, others are very real. This is what park rangers don't tell you. When I first saw the job posting for a backcountry ranger position in the Denali Wilderness, something inside me snapped to attention. 3 years out of college with a forestry degree gathering dust in a Seattle office cubicle had left me hollow. The mountains were calling, not in some poetic Muir-esque whisper, but in a desperate, primal scream that echoed through my dreams. I needed escape. I needed purpose. I needed silence. The posting mentioned extreme isolation, self-sufficiency required, and minimal contact with civilization, as if they were warnings. To me, they read like promises. I applied that night. 2 weeks later, I was packing everything I owned into my truck and heading north toward Alaska. The ranger station they assigned me to wasn't even on most maps. Locals called it a Hoatswatch, an old Athabascan term that roughly translated to the restless one's gaze. I learned later that a Hoat had been an indigenous scout who claimed to have encountered strange entities in these woods over a century ago. The stories varied, but all ended with Ahote vanishing during a winter storm. His body never recovered. The name should have been my first warning. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, a single room with a wood stove, propane appliances, a shortwave radio, and solar panels that provided just enough electricity for basic needs. The nearest town was Kantishna, over 40 miles of wilderness away. My supervisor, Jackson, an older ranger with weathered skin and calculating eyes, flew me in via bush plane on a crisp September morning. "Winter comes early here," he said as we unloaded my gear. "First heavy snow usually hits by early October. After that, you're on your own until spring thaw. You sure you're up for this?" I nodded, surveying the endless spruce forest that surrounded us. The Alaskan wilderness stretched in every direction, no roads, no trails, just ancient trees and mountains scraping the sky. "The Athabascan people have stories about these woods," Jackson continued, his voice dropping slightly. "They say the land remembers. It watches. Sounds like nonsense until you've spent a few nights alone out here." He showed me the patrol routes, emergency protocols, and weather monitoring equipment. My job was straightforward: maintain the outpost, assist any lost hikers or climbers, monitor wildlife activity, and report any unusual environmental changes. Standard ranger duties, but in one of the most isolated regions of North America. "Most important rule," Jackson said before climbing back into his plane. "Never ignore your instincts out here. Something feels wrong, something is wrong." I watched his plane shrink into the vast Alaskan sky until it disappeared completely. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic noise, no human voices. Just wind through spruce needles and distant bird calls. That first week was pure liberation. I patrolled my sector daily, cataloging animal tracks, noting changes in vegetation, and capturing the raw beauty of the landscape in my journal. The autumn colors blazed against green conifers. Crimson tundra and golden birch groves set the mountains on fire with color. At night, I'd sit outside with a mug of coffee, watching the northern lights dance across the star-filled sky. I'd never felt so connected to a place, so present. The first unsettling incident occurred during my second week. I was following moose tracks along a creek bed when I noticed something odd. The tracks suddenly stopped, as if the animal had vanished mid-stride. All around the final prints, the soft mud was undisturbed. No signs of predators, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened, just tracks that ended abruptly. I radioed Jackson that evening during our scheduled check-in. "Predation doesn't work that way," I told him, describing what I'd found. There was a long pause before he responded. "Mark it in your log. Might be nothing, might be something to watch for." That night I woke suddenly at 3 a.m. The temperature in the cabin had dropped drastically, my breath fogging in the darkness. The fire in the wood stove had died completely, though I'd stoked it before bed. As I reached for my flashlight, I heard something outside. Not the familiar sounds of nocturnal wildlife, but a rhythmic scraping against the cabin wall. Slow, deliberate, almost like fingers testing the wood. I sat frozen, straining to listen. The scraping moved around the perimeter of the cabin, pausing occasionally, as if whatever made the sound was listening too. When it reached the window, I heard what sounded like breathing, ragged and wet, unlike any animal I knew. The hairs on my neck prickled. After what felt like hours, the sounds retreated. I spent the remainder of the night with my back against the wall, knife in hand, watching the door until dawn broke. In the morning light, I examined the exterior walls. No scratch marks, no tracks in the dirt around the cabin. Nothing to prove what I'd heard was real. But I knew what I'd heard. And from that moment on, I began to feel as though I wasn't alone in these woods, as though something had noticed my arrival at a Hote's watch, something that moved through the ancient forest with purpose, something that was watching me. October arrived with the first dusting of snow and a sense of growing unease. What had begun as isolated incidents, strange sounds, unexplained tracks, was evolving into a pattern I couldn't ignore. 2 weeks after the night visitation, I found unusual tracks in a fresh patch of snow during my morning patrol. They resembled large canine prints, but weren't quite right, too elongated, with what looked like opposable thumbs. The stride length suggested something that walked partially upright. I photographed them, measured the depth and dimensions, and sent the data to Jackson during our next radio contact. His response was uncharacteristically terse. "Some things in Alaska don't match field guides," he said. "Best left alone. Change your patrol route for a few days." I should have taken his advice. Instead, curiosity pulled me deeper into the mystery. I began documenting every unusual occurrence in a separate journal. Dead animals found in unnatural positions, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Bird calls that silenced abruptly, leaving pockets of complete quiet in the forest. The persistent feeling of being observed whenever I ventured more than a mile from the cabin. The locals had tales about these woods, stories of skin stealers, or those who walk wrong. Before modern communication, dozens of people had vanished in this region, their disappearances attributed to the harsh environment. But indigenous stories hinted at darker explanations. I'd dismissed these as folklore designed to keep people alert in dangerous wilderness. Now, I wasn't so certain. On a gray afternoon in mid-October, I discovered a deer carcass unlike any predator kill I'd documented. The animal had been carefully skinned, the hide removed in one piece without a single cut mark. The meat remained untouched. Most disturbing was the positioning. The deer had been propped upright against a tree, its empty eye sockets facing directly toward the path to my cabin, as if it had been placed there as a message. I photographed everything, then burned the carcass. Protocol for disease control, I told myself, but truthfully, I couldn't bear leaving it as I'd found it. The wrongness of it settled in my stomach like cold lead. That night, the temperature plummeted to 15 below. The first major snowstorm of the season drove sideways against the cabin walls. I kept the wood stove burning hot, the howling wind outside merging with the crackle of flames. Despite the bitter cold outside, I sweated beneath my thermal layers, a nameless dread building with each passing hour. Just after midnight, the wind abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was jarring, unnatural, like the world holding its breath. In that silence, I heard footsteps in the fresh snow outside. Slow, methodical steps circling the cabin. I extinguished my lantern and moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. The moonlight reflected brilliantly off the snow, illuminating a figure standing 20 yards from the cabin. Its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, back hunched at an impossible angle. It stood upright like a man, but moved with jerking motions that reminded me of damaged clockwork. The face remained in shadow, but I could see it was wearing what appeared to be animal hides stitched together. As if sensing my gaze, the figure's head snapped toward the window with inhuman speed. I dropped to the floor, heart hammering against my ribs. Minutes passed before I dared look again. When I did, the figure had vanished, but a new set of tracks led from where it had stood directly to my woodpile. The axe I'd left embedded in the chopping block was missing. I spent the night with my service pistol in hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin settling in the cold. Come dawn, I searched the perimeter. The tracks remained, clear in the fresh snow, the same elongated prints I'd documented earlier, but now with a purposeful path around my cabin. My axe was back in the chopping block, but the blade had been licked clean of rust, the metal polished to a mirror shine. I radioed Jackson immediately, no longer caring if I sounded paranoid. "I need to know what's out here," I said after describing the night's events. "These aren't normal animal encounters." The radio crackled with static before his voice came through, more solemn than I'd ever heard it. "The Athabascans call it Ye Nald Lushi, the one who walks on all fours. Other tribes have different names. Skinwalker is the term most outsiders know." He paused. "I didn't tell you everything when you took this post. There's a reason we keep a Hote's watch manned year-round, even in winter when no hikers come through." "You're using rangers as bait?" My voice rose with indignation. "Not bait. Witnesses, monitors. Something's been in those woods for generations. Something that doesn't appear in any wildlife census. The indigenous people knew to avoid certain areas. We're trying to understand what we're dealing with." "By putting people at risk? People like me?" "By placing trained observers in controlled environments. You've got shelter, communication, weapons, more protection than the trappers and prospectors who first reported these encounters." Jackson's tone softened slightly. "Look, I can have a helicopter extract you when the weather clears, but your observations could help us understand something that's been haunting these woods for centuries." I glanced out the window at the vast wilderness surrounding me. The rational part of my brain argued that I was experiencing a combination of isolation-induced paranoia and encounters with unknown but natural wildlife. Yet, deeper instincts, the same primal awareness that helped our ancestors survive, told me something truly abnormal was stalking these woods. "I'll stay," I said finally. "But I want all the information you have, no more half-truths. I'll send what we know in the next supply drop. Weather permitting, that's 3 days from now." Jackson hesitated. "Until then, keep your doors secured after dark. And whatever you do, if you hear your name called from the woods, even in a voice you recognize, don't answer. Don't even acknowledge it." The radio went silent, leaving me alone with the implication of his warning. Outside my window, the pristine snow stretched untouched toward the tree line, except for the single track of elongated footprints that led from my cabin into the dark heart of the forest. The blizzard intensified over the next 2 days, making the promised supply drop impossible. I was effectively stranded at a Hote's watch, with dwindling supplies and growing evidence that something intelligent and malevolent was monitoring my every move. Each morning revealed new tracks circling the cabin, sometimes human-like, sometimes resembling a large wolf, but always with subtle wrongness that made my skin crawl. On the third night, as wind-driven snow pelted the windows, my radio crackled to life. Through bursts of static, I heard a voice, not Jackson's official ranger tone, but something desperate and frightened. "Help, lost, coordinates." The transmission cut in and out. "3 of us, injured. Please respond." I grabbed the radio. "This is Ranger at a Hote's watch. What's your location?" "Over." More static then. "Thank God. About 5 miles northeast of red backpack, flare gun, attacked by, please hurry." The transmission died completely. I tried repeatedly to re-establish contact without success. Protocol dictated waiting for backup before attempting rescue in extreme weather conditions. But backup wasn't coming, not in this storm. And if there were truly injured hikers out there, they wouldn't survive the night. I gathered emergency supplies, first aid kit, extra layers, snowshoes, compass, flares, my rifle, and enough provisions for a day's journey. The temperature had dropped to 20 below, with wind chill pushing it closer to 40 below, conditions where exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Jackson's warning echoed in my mind as I prepared to leave. "If you hear your name called from the woods, even in a voice you recognize, don't answer." But these weren't voices calling my name. They were lost souls needing help, the very reason I'd taken this position. I set out just before dawn, when the storm had temporarily abated. The snow was thigh-deep in places, making progress achingly slow even with snowshoes. I navigated by compass, pushing northeast as the distress call had indicated. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow dampening all sound except my labored breathing. 3 hours into my search, I spotted a splash of color against the white landscape. A red backpack half buried in snow. Around it, signs of a campsite hastily abandoned, a collapsed tent, scattered equipment. But no people, and strangely no tracks leading away. I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. No response. As I examined the campsite, details emerged that sent ice through my veins. The tent hadn't collapsed. It had been shredded from the inside out, as if someone had desperately clawed their way out. The sleeping bags were slashed in similar fashion. Most disturbing was the backpack. While it appeared normal from a distance, closer inspection revealed it wasn't manufactured fabric but something organic. Animal hide dyed red and crudely stitched to resemble a modern backpack. I keyed my radio with trembling fingers. "Jackson, come in, this is a Hote's watch." Only static answered. A twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled, rifle raised, to find nothing but empty woods. Yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I scanned the tree line, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures standing motionless among the distant pines. Too far to make out details, but something in their posture seemed wrong, as if they were puppets held by invisible strings. I raised my hand in greeting. They did not respond. I shouted, asking if they needed help. Still nothing. When I took a step toward them, they retreated in perfect unison, maintaining the exact same distance. "I'm a park ranger," I called. "I received your distress signal." One figure separated from the others, moving sideways with jerky, uncoordinated movements. It stopped behind a large spruce, partially hidden. Then, impossibly, I heard a voice directly behind me. "We're so glad you came." I spun around to find no one there. The voice, a perfect mimicry of human speech, but with subtle undertones that raised every hair on my body, seemed to come from empty air. When I turned back, the 3 figures had vanished. In their place was a single set of tracks, the same elongated, not quite human prints I'd documented around my cabin. I realized with sickening clarity that there had never been any lost hikers. The distress call, the campsite, all elaborate bait in a trap I'd willingly walked into. Whatever stalked these woods was intelligent enough to use human technology to mimic human voices, to understand our instinct to help others in danger. The weather shifted suddenly, as if responding to my realization. Snow began falling again, thick curtains that reduced visibility to mere feet. The wind rose to a howl that sounded disturbingly like laughter. I abandoned the fake campsite, pushing through the deepening snow toward what I hoped was the direction of my cabin. The landmarks I'd carefully noted on my journey out were now obscured. My compass spun uselessly, the needle rotating in complete circles. As daylight faded, panic clawed at my throat. I was lost in a blizzard, being hunted by something that knew these woods infinitely better than I did. Night fell completely. The temperature plummeted further. I found shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation and built a small fire, knowing the light might attract predators, both natural and otherwise, but having no choice if I wanted to survive the night. As I huddled by the meager flames, shapes moved in the darkness beyond my small circle of light. Not approaching, just circling, watching. Occasionally I caught glimpses of eyes reflecting the firelight, sometimes at human height, sometimes lower to the ground, as if whatever watched me could change its form at will. Then came the voices, whispers that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. My name repeated in different tones, the voices of my parents, my college friends, Jackson. People I knew couldn't possibly be in these woods. Each called to me, asking me to come to them, telling me they were lost and needed help. I remembered Jackson's warning and remained silent, focusing on maintaining my fire as it burned dangerously low. The voices grew increasingly desperate, then angry. The whispers transformed into something else, a sound like wet leather stretching and tearing, punctuated by clicking noises that resembled bones snapping into new configurations. Dawn broke after what felt like eternity. The storm had passed, revealing a blindingly bright landscape of pristine snow. Around my shelter, a perfect circle of tracks surrounded where I'd spent the night. Hundreds of overlapping prints showing whatever had made them had paced continuously, never approaching closer than 10 feet from my fire, never retreating further than 20. With daylight came clarity. I identified the North Star and began trudging in what I hoped was the direction of a Hote's watch. After hours of exhausting travel, I crested a ridge and felt a surge of relief. My cabin stood in the valley below, smoke curling from the chimney. Smoke I hadn't left burning. I approached cautiously, rifle ready. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the wood stove blazed hot, though I'd extinguished it before leaving. My supplies had been rummaged through, drawers left open, food containers examined. Nothing was missing. Rather, something had been added. On my bed lay a crude doll made from twigs and sinew, wrapped in what appeared to be freshly cured deer hide. Its featureless face was turned toward the door, as if waiting for my return. The message was clear. I hadn't escaped. I'd been allowed to find my way back. The radio sputtered to life the next morning during the scheduled check-in. I'd spent a sleepless night barricaded inside the cabin, the hide doll locked in a metal storage box outside. Jackson's voice came through clearer than I'd expected, the storm having finally passed. "Supply drop's been rerouted to Kontishna," he informed me. "Weather's still too unstable for direct delivery to your location. You'll need to hike out to the old mining camp at Moose Creek. Pilot can reach that landing zone." "Jackson, someone was in my cabin while I was out searching for those hikers who never existed." I related the events of the previous day, my voice tight with barely controlled panic. A long silence followed. "Coordinates coming through to your GPS," he finally responded, ignoring everything I'd told him. "Local guide will meet you at Moose Creek. Name's Coda, Athabascan Elder. He has information that might help you understand what you're dealing with." "You knew, didn't you?" I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. "You knew what was out here, what I'd be facing." "Not exactly. We know something's out there. Have for generations. But it doesn't show itself to everyone. Doesn't interact with everyone. The fact that it's taken an interest in you, that's significant data." "I'm not your lab rat," I shouted into the radio. "No, you're not," Jackson agreed, his tone softening. "You're a ranger who's encountered something beyond normal experience. Coda can explain better than I can. His people have lived alongside this phenomenon for centuries." The hike to Moose Creek would be arduous, 15 miles through deep snow and difficult terrain. But the alternative was remaining at a Hote's Watch, alone with whatever had decided to make me its focus. I packed essential supplies, secured the cabin, and set out before noon. The journey took 9 exhausting hours. Twice I found those distinctive tracks paralleling mine, always keeping a consistent distance, never approaching directly. Occasionally, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something flowing between trees like liquid shadow. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. Moose Creek was a cluster of abandoned mining cabins nestled in a protected valley. As I approached, smoke rose from the chimney of the largest structure. An old pickup truck with chains on its tires was parked outside, the first sign of modern civilization I'd seen in weeks. A figure emerged from the cabin door as I trudged the final yards. The man was elderly but moved with surprising grace. His weathered face spoke of decades in the Alaskan wilderness, deep lines etched around eyes that missed nothing. He wore practical winter gear with traditional moosehide mukluks on his feet. "You made good time," he said simply. "I am Coda. Come inside before the shadows lengthen." The cabin interior was warm and smelled of cedar smoke and strong coffee. Coda gestured for me to sit at a rough-hewn table while he poured 2 mugs from a battered pot on the wood stove. "You've seen it," he stated rather than asked. "The one who watches, the one who changes." I nodded, suddenly unable to speak as exhaustion and delayed shock washed over me. "Our people have known of these beings since before Russian or European contact," Coda continued. "We call them many names, but their nature remains the same. Hunters who wear skins not their own. Shapeshifters who steal voices and memories." "Skinwalkers," I managed. Coda nodded. "That is the Navajo term that has become common. Each tribe has their own stories, their own encounters. Here in Alaska, they are particularly powerful due to the isolation, the extremes of light and dark through the seasons." "What does it want?" I asked. "They are hunters, first and foremost, but not like wolf or bear who hunt for sustenance. They hunt for the pleasure of fear. They feed on terror as much as flesh." Coda sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "They are drawn to certain people, those with sensitivity to the land. Those who can sense the hidden world beneath the visible one. Like Ahote, I said, remembering the name of my station, the Restless One. Something flickered in Koda's eyes, surprise perhaps. You know of Ahote? Only that he disappeared a century ago after claiming to see strange things in the woods. Koda set down his mug. Ahote was my great-grandfather's brother, a scout for our village. He did not disappear. He became something else, something that still walks those woods. Cold understanding settled in my stomach. The Skinwalker I've been encountering may very well be what remains of Ahote, yes, or something wearing his memories. Koda studied me intently. The danger you face is not just physical. These beings seek to transform those they hunt, to change them. The process begins with isolation, then escalates to fear, then to a breaking of the mind. Finally, they offer a choice, become like them or become their prey. How do I stop it? I asked. You cannot kill what was never truly alive in the human sense, but you can resist. You can refuse its game. From a leather pouch, Koda withdrew a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. My ancestors developed protections, methods to make oneself unappetizing to these hunters. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a stone amulet on a leather cord, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Obsidian absorbs negative energies. The markings are prayers of protection. I don't understand why Jackson sent me here instead of just evacuating me, I said, accepting the amulet. Perhaps because some battles must be faced, not fled from. Koda's gaze was piercing. Your ranger supervisor knows these woods harbor secrets. The government has files dating back to the Gold Rush era, reports of creatures that defy classification. They need observers, witnesses. And if the observers don't survive? That too is data. Koda's bluntness was chilling. But you have advantages Ahote did not. Knowledge, preparation, tools. He gestured to the amulet. And you have choice. You can leave these woods and never return. Many do. The implications hung heavy in the cabin's warm air. I could walk away from Ahote's watch, from whatever ancient horror had fixed its attention on me. Return to city life, to normalcy. But something in me recoiled at the thought of retreat. There's more you're not telling me, I said. Koda nodded slowly. The Skinwalker that haunts your station has been growing bolder over decades. 3 rangers before you encountered it. None reported experiences as intense as yours. It is escalating, preparing for something. A transformation, perhaps, or a feeding cycle. What happened to those rangers? 2 requested immediate transfer after their encounters. The third, Koda hesitated. She remained for her full season. When spring came, she seemed changed, withdrawn. She left the service shortly after and moved to a remote homestead north of here. She lives alone, allows no visitors. Locals avoid her property. The implication was clear. The former ranger had been altered by her experience, possibly corrupted. The pilot will arrive tomorrow morning, Koda said, standing. You'll need rest before your return journey. Return journey, I echoed. To Ahote's watch? Unless you choose to leave. Koda studied me. But I sense you won't. The curiosity that drives you is the same that drives the Skinwalker. Perhaps that is why it has chosen you. That night, in the relative safety of Koda's cabin, I dreamed of running through endless woods, my body changing with each stride, limbs elongating, skin peeling away to reveal something other beneath. Behind me, something pursued. Ahead, something beckoned. Both were the same entity, reflected like images in opposing mirrors. I woke, gasping, the amulet burning cold against my chest where I'd placed it before sleep. Outside, the northern lights danced across the sky in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like signals meant for someone who knew how to read them. By morning, I'd made my decision. I would return to Ahote's watch, not as prey, but as witness. Whatever ancient horror stalked those woods had chosen to reveal itself to me. Now I would choose to understand it, on my terms. As dawn broke, Koda watched me prepare with knowing eyes. Remember, he said, as we waited for the distant sound of the approaching bush plane, it will try to make you question your senses, your sanity. It will offer things, knowledge, power, transformation. In refusing, you find strength. And if it attacks directly, I asked, then you run, Coda said simply. You run toward water, toward dawn, toward places where many humans have gathered. It prefers isolation, darkness, places forgotten by human memory. The plane appeared on the horizon, a tiny speck growing larger against the vast Alaskan sky. Soon I would return to the woods, where something ancient and hungry waited. Something that had once been human, perhaps. Something that wanted me to become like it. I touched the stone amulet at my throat and prepared for the next phase of my strange vigil at a Hot's Watch. The bush plane dropped me at a makeshift landing strip 2 miles from a Hot's Watch. The pilot, a taciturn woman who introduced herself only as B, seemed familiar with the area, but asked no questions about my assignment. As I unloaded my supplies, she offered only one comment. Be careful out there. Weather report says another storm system moving in, 3 days, maybe less. I hiked back to the cabin with newfound vigilance, Coda's amulet cold against my skin beneath my layers. The forest felt different now, not just wilderness, but a realm with its own consciousness, its own rules. Every shadow, every sound carried potential meaning. I found myself analyzing each bent twig, each animal track with forensic intensity. A Hot's Watch appeared untouched when I arrived. The hide doll remained locked in the metal box where I'd left it. Inside, everything was as I'd left it, except for the subtle scent of wet earth and decay that hadn't been there before. It dissipated when I built a fire and heated the space, but the impression remained. Something had been inside, moving through my living space, touching my belongings. That evening, I established new protective measures. I created a perimeter of salt around the cabin. An old superstition Coda had mentioned might help. I positioned mirrors facing outward at each window, another folklore remedy. I kept my service pistol loaded and within reach. Most importantly, I maintained radio contact with Jackson every 4 hours, day and night, giving him precise updates on any unusual occurrences. For 2 days, nothing happened. The forest remained quiet except for normal wildlife sounds. No tracks appeared around the cabin. No shadows moved against natural patterns. I began to wonder if my confrontation with the entity, my acknowledgement of its existence perhaps, had somehow diminished its interest in me. On the 3rd day, the storm B had predicted rolled in. By nightfall, visibility dropped to 0 as snow and wind battered the cabin. The temperature plummeted to 30 below. I radioed Jackson with a weather update, receiving only fragmented response through the interference. I was effectively isolated again. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to complete silence. The howling wind had stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural quiet. The fire had died to embers, casting the cabin in gloom. As consciousness fully returned, I realized what had awakened me. A sound like fingernails, slowly dragging across the cabin's exterior walls. I reached for my flashlight, but found it missing from its usual place. The scratching continued, moving methodically around the perimeter. When it reached the window, I saw a shadow darker than the surrounding night press against the glass. Not a human silhouette, not an animal shape, but something that seemed to flow and reform like smoke with substance. The temperature inside the cabin dropped rapidly. My breath formed clouds in the darkness. The shadow at the window stretched, elongating impossible limbs until it enveloped the entire glass surface. The scratching stopped, replaced by a sound I'll never forget. A wet, sliding noise like raw meat being pulled across gravel. Then came the voice, not from outside but seemingly from inside my own head. I have worn many skins, it said, the words forming directly in my mind rather than passing through my ears. I would know the feel of yours. I fumbled for my service weapon, aiming it at the window, though instinct told me bullets would be useless. Leave me alone, I commanded, voice steadier than I expected. A sound like branches breaking erupted from everywhere at once. It took me moments to recognize it as laughter. Alone, the voice in my head responded. You came to my territory seeking isolation. You came looking for me, Ranger. Before you ever saw this cabin, before you left your city life, you were already responding to my call. The shadow at the window receded slightly, condensing into a more defined shape. Still not human, still not animal, but something with purpose and form. Within the darkness, eyes opened, not 2, but dozens, blinking at different intervals. "What do you want?" I demanded. "To offer a choice," came the response. "The same choice Ahote faced. The same choice all who dwell too long in these woods must eventually confront." The shadow thing pressed against the glass again, and the window frosted instantly with intricate patterns. Not random ice crystals, but deliberate designs that resolved into a face. My face, rendered in frost, but wrong in subtle ways. The eyes too wide, the mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You could become more than human," the voice continued. "See what I see, move as I move, hunt as I hunt. Never again fear cold or hunger or death." The offer resonated with something primal within me, a yearning to transcend human limitations, to merge with the wilderness I'd sought out. For a terrifying moment, I felt myself considering it. Then Koda's amulet pulsed against my skin, burning cold enough to snap me back to clarity. "No," I said firmly. "I know what you are. What you do, I refuse." The frost face on the window contorted in rage. The cabin shuddered as something massive pressed against it from all sides simultaneously. Wood creaked, nails protested. The structure itself seemed to inhale under pressure. "Then you are prey," the voice roared in my mind, loud enough to send me staggering. The window shattered inward, glass shards exploding across the room. Through the opening surged not wind or snow, but a darkness with substance. Flowing, reaching, grasping. It smelled of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something metallic like old blood. I fired my weapon into the mass. The muzzle flash illuminated what entered my cabin, a nightmare collage of animal parts and human features, constantly shifting and reforming. Where a face should be, I glimpsed an exposed skull wrapped in strips of deer hide. Antlers protruded from its shoulders. Its limbs ended in hands that were more like claws, elongated and jointed in too many places. My bullets passed through it without effect. The entity flowed around the salt line I'd created, momentarily confused by the barrier, then gathered itself and leaped directly over it. The mirrors on the windows cracked simultaneously as it fully entered the cabin. I retreated to the furthest corner, weapon useless, adrenaline surging. The Skinwalker advanced in jerking motions, its form unstable in the cabin's light. As it neared, I felt my thoughts becoming sluggish, as if its proximity drained something essential from the air itself. "Your fear is delicious," the voice purred in my head. "It has been too long since I tasted such pure terror." My back pressed against the wall, nowhere left to retreat. The entity towered over me now, its constantly shifting form resolving momentarily into something almost human. A tall figure wrapped in animal hides, face obscured by shadow except for gleaming eyes that reflected no light. It reached for me with impossible limbs that stretched and distorted. The fingers that brushed my cheek felt like ice-covered bone wrapped in wet leather. At its touch, visions flooded my mind. Running through forests at impossible speed, hunting prey that screamed with human voices, the ecstasy of transformation as skin and bone reconfigured into new forms. "See what I offer," the Skinwalker whispered directly into my thoughts. "Power beyond mortality." With my last coherent thought, I clutched Koda's amulet and tore it from my neck, pressing it directly against the entity's shifting chest. A sound like 1,000 voices screaming erupted from the Skinwalker. It recoiled violently, its form destabilizing into roiling shadow. I seized the moment and lunged past it toward the broken window. Glass sliced my arm as I dove through the opening into the bitter, cold night. The snow broke my fall as I rolled and scrambled to my feet. Behind me, the Skinwalker's rage manifested as a physical force. The cabin's roof beam splintered, the chimney collapsed. Remembering Koda's advice, I ran toward the creek that flowed a quarter-mile from the cabin. "Water," he had said. The entities avoided crossing moving water. The snow impeded my progress, each step requiring tremendous effort. The temperature was cold enough to kill within hours of exposure, and I'd fled without proper gear. Behind me, something flowed from the shattered cabin, not running but gliding over the snow's surface, a shadow that distorted the moonlight around it. It moved with terrible purpose, closing the distance between us with each passing second. The creek appeared ahead, its surface partially frozen but with water still flowing beneath. I pushed harder, lungs burning in the frigid air. 20 yards. 10. The Skinwalker's presence pressed against my back like a physical weight. As I reached the creek's edge, claws raked across my shoulder blades, tearing through my shirt and drawing blood. The pain was shocking, not just physical but somehow soul-deep, as if the Skinwalker's touch affected more than flesh. I stumbled forward into the icy water, gasping as it soaked my lower body. The entity halted at the water's edge, its form rippling with frustration. In the moonlight, it resolved again into that almost human shape, watching me with eyes that reflected like an animal's. "You cannot escape," it said, the words forming in frost patterns on the water's surface. "This is my territory, my hunting ground. You will tire, you will freeze, you will return to the warmth eventually." It was right. Hypothermia would claim me within hours. The creek provided only temporary sanctuary. As if sensing my realization, the Skinwalker settled at the bank, its form condensing into a crouching position, waiting. Above us, the northern lights suddenly intensified, bathing the landscape in shifting green and purple. The Skinwalker's form seemed to waver under the aurora's glow, becoming temporarily less substantial. It hissed, an actual sound, not a mental projection, and retreated slightly from the creek bank. I remembered fragments of Athabascan lore Coda had shared, how the northern lights were believed to be the dancing spirits of ancestors, how they provided protection against dark entities. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence. While the Skinwalker was distracted by the aurora, I waded downstream, fighting the current and the numbing cold. My feet lost sensation first, then my legs. Each step became an act of pure will. The entity paralleled my movement along the bank, never approaching the water but never losing sight of me. After what felt like miles, the creek widened into a small lake. On the far shore, impossibly, I saw lights, the glow of windows from what appeared to be another cabin. Hope surged through me despite my deteriorating condition. I changed direction, wading toward the far shore. The Skinwalker paced anxiously, its form becoming increasingly unstable under the intensifying aurora. As I struggled through deepening water, my strength fading, it suddenly leapt into the air, transforming mid-jump into something with wings. Not a bird, but a nightmare approximation with too many joints and membranous surfaces. It circled overhead, descending toward the center of the lake where I now struggled to stay above water. Coda hadn't mentioned if the creatures could fly over water. Perhaps this one had found a loophole in the ancient rules. As talons reached for me from above, the ice beneath my feet gave way completely. I plunged into the freezing water, darkness closing in as hypothermia accelerated. The last thing I saw before consciousness faded was the Skinwalker hovering above the water's surface, its constantly changing face resolving briefly into a familiar countenance, my own features staring back at me, wearing an expression of hungry anticipation. I should have died in that lake. By all physiological logic, the combination of hypothermia, blood loss, and trauma should have ended my life. Instead, I woke to warmth, the crackle of a wood fire, and the smell of spruce resin and medicinal herbs. My eyes opened to an unfamiliar ceiling, rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of smoke. I lay wrapped in thick furs on a narrow bed. My clothes had been removed, my wounds dressed with poultices that smelled of pine and something bitter. When I tried to move, pain lanced through my body, centered on the claw marks across my back. "Stay still," said a woman's voice. "The wounds are deep, not just in flesh." I turned my head with effort. A woman in her 60s sat in a rocking chair near the fire, her silver hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was weathered but strong, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Something about her seemed familiar, though I was certain we'd never met. Where? My voice emerged as a croak. "My cabin, northern edge of the lake." She rose and brought me water in a tin cup. "You can call me Marion." As she helped me drink, I noticed the Park Service insignia tattooed on her wrist, older style from perhaps 20 years ago. Understanding dawned. "You were stationed at Ahot's Watch," I said. "The ranger Coda mentioned." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps wariness. "Coda talks too much." "He said you encountered the Skinwalker, that you changed afterward?" Marion set the cup down with deliberate care. "Is that what he called it? Skinwalker?" "What would you call it?" "Nothing. Names give power." She prodded the fire with an iron poker. What I encountered defies categorization. Not spirit, not flesh, not energy. Something that exists between states. Something old. It attacked me, I said. Destroyed my cabin. Chased me into the lake. And yet here you are. Marian's gaze was uncomfortably penetrating. It could have killed you many times over. It chose not to. Ask yourself why. The implication sent a chill through me, despite the warm cabin. It said something about offering a choice. The same choice a Hote faced. Marian nodded slowly. Transformation, transcendence, power beyond human limitations. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing a forearm marked with what I initially took for additional tattoos. But as I looked closer, I realized they were scars. Ritual markings carved into flesh, forming patterns similar to those on Koda's amulet. You refused, I whispered. I chose humanity, with all its weaknesses and inevitable end. Her voice held no regret. But refusal has consequences. The entity doesn't simply go away. It watches, waits, tests. Is that why you live here? So close to its territory? Marian's lips curved in what might have been a smile. I monitor, document, warn when necessary. Someone must bear witness. She moved to a bookshelf and returned with a leather-bound journal. I've recorded every manifestation, every pattern, every theory about what drives it. 20 years of observation. Marian opened the journal to reveal meticulous notes, drawings, maps marked with sighting locations. The detail was impressive. Scientific methodology applied to something science didn't acknowledge. What have you learned? I asked. That it's not alone. Marian's voice dropped. These woods harbor more than one entity. They're territorial. They compete. Sometimes they take human subjects not as prey, but as ambassadors, representatives. The implication struck me with terrible clarity. A Hote became something neither human nor entity, a bridge between worlds. Marian closed the journal. The transformation isn't always physical. Sometimes it's a merging of consciousness, a sharing of perspective that forever alters the human participant. I struggled to sit up despite the pain. How do I stop it? How do I protect myself? You don't. Marian's bluntness was jarring. Not completely, not forever. You've been marked now. It will always know your scent, your thoughts. Distance helps. Urban areas with many humans confuse entities like this. Too much mental noise, too many overlapping energies. So I run? Leave my post? That depends, Marian said, studying me, on why you came to Alaska in the first place. What were you seeking in these woods, Ranger? Truth? Purpose? Escape? The question struck deeper than I expected. Why had I abandoned city life for one of the most isolated ranger positions in North America? The easy answer was love of wilderness, desire for adventure. But beneath that lay something else. A dissatisfaction with ordinary existence, a yearning for something transcendent. I wanted meaning, I admitted. Connection to something larger than human society. Marian nodded, as if confirming a suspicion. That's what it senses in you. That hunger, that openness to possibility beyond conventional reality. It's why it chose you, as it chose me, as it chose a Hote before us. What happens now? You heal, you decide. You either leave these woods forever, or you accept the reality of what exists here and find a way to coexist with that knowledge. Marian rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the night. Dawn comes in 3 hours. The entity's power wanes with daylight. We'll speak more then. I drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams filled with running through endless woods, my perspective shifting between hunter and hunted. When I woke again, weak morning light filtered through frost-covered windows. Marian sat at a small table, writing in her journal. Your supervisor radioed, she said without looking up. Jackson, I told him you survived, that your station was compromised. He's sending extraction, weather permitting. Did you tell him about the Skinwalker? There's no need. He knows. Marian set down her pen. The Park Service has files on these phenomena dating back to the 1920s. Reports from rangers, trappers, indigenous sources. Most are classified. Some agencies see these entities as potential resources, intelligence assets with capabilities beyond human limitations. That's insane, I said. Is it? A being that can alter its physical form at will, that can access human minds, that can survive in conditions that would kill any known organism? Marion's expression was grave. Many would consider such abilities valuable. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. Had I been stationed at Ahot's watch, not just to observe, but as potential bait, was Jackson's real mission assessment of these entities for governmental purposes? The extraction team arrives tomorrow, Marion continued. Until then, you need to decide what happens afterward, what story you tell, what truth you carry forward. What did you tell them after your encounter? Marion's gaze was steady. I reported unusual wildlife activity, unexplained phenomena consistent with extreme isolation and weather conditions. Nothing that would raise official eyebrows or end my career. You lied. I chose to maintain access, to position myself where I could continue observation. She gestured at her isolated cabin. From here, I monitor patterns, warn seasonal workers, hikers, redirect research teams, small interventions that save lives without exposing the full truth. And the Skinwalker allows this? We have an understanding. Something shifted in Marion's eyes. A momentary otherness that vanished so quickly, I questioned whether I'd seen it. It tests me occasionally, reminds me of its presence, but it respects boundaries in its fashion. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows. The wilderness beyond seemed alive with purpose, watching, waiting. It will come for you again, Marion said matter-of-factly. Not today, perhaps not this season, but it recognized something in you, potential, compatibility. It doesn't relinquish interests easily. How do I fight it next time? Not by force, not with weapons or technology. Marion touched the ritual scars on her arm. With will, with clarity about what you are and are not willing to become. The entity feeds on ambivalence, exploits inner conflict. Know your boundaries absolutely. Throughout that day, as my strength gradually returned, Marion shared her accumulated knowledge, practical defenses, warning signs, patterns of manifestation. She spoke of the Skinwalker with clinical detachment, like a biologist discussing a particularly dangerous predator species. Yet underlying her scientific approach was something else, a hint of reluctant respect, perhaps even understanding. You've communicated with it, I realized as evening approached. More than just encounters, actual exchange. Marion was silent for a long moment. There are nights, she finally said, when the boundary between minds grows thin, when thoughts flow both ways across the divide between human and other. Yes, we have communicated. What does it want? Ultimately, to evolve, to expand, to experience existence through different vessels. Marion's voice took on a distant quality. These entities remember a time before human consciousness dominated this landscape. They adapt by incorporating aspects of what threatens them, by understanding it from within. The extraction helicopter arrived the next morning, landing on the frozen lake surface. The medical technician who examined me seemed puzzled by the nature of my wounds, the claw marks that refused to follow normal healing patterns, the lingering cold that no amount of external warmth seemed to touch. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at Marion's cabin growing smaller below us. She stood watching from her doorway, a solitary figure at the wilderness edge. Guardian or collaborator, resistance or bridge, perhaps both. Jackson debriefed me at regional headquarters. I told him about the structural failure of Ahot's watch during the storm, about being stranded in sub-zero conditions, about Marion's rescue. I said nothing about the Skinwalker, nothing about transformations or choices offered in the night. He nodded, made notes, asked remarkably few follow-up questions. We'll reassign you once you've recovered, he said. Perhaps something less isolated. The Kenai Peninsula has openings. And Ahot's watch? We'll rebuild come spring, stations too strategically important to abandon. Who will you send? I asked, unable to keep accusation from my tone. Jackson studied me for a long moment. Someone suitable, he finally said. Someone who can handle the unique challenges of that environment. I took medical leave, spent weeks in Anchorage recovering physically, but mentally I remained in those woods. In dreams I still heard the Skinwalker's voice offering transformation. still felt the cold touch of something ancient and patient reaching across the divide between its reality and mine. 3 months later, I requested reassignment to wilderness patrol along the boundary of Denali National Park. Not a Hoats watch itself, but within the same region, close enough to maintain vigilance, to warn others when necessary, to monitor an ancient presence that the modern world refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes, on patrol during long winter nights when the aurora dances overhead, I sense it watching from the tree line, not threatening, not retreating, simply observing, waiting to see what choice I'll ultimately make in this strange communion between human consciousness and something far older that moves through these woods wearing borrowed skins. I keep my own journal now, documenting each encounter, each manifestation, building on Marion's work, creating a record for whoever comes after me in this generational vigil. For the Skinwalker's patience extends beyond human lifespans. It remembers a Hoat. It will remember me long after I'm gone. And sometimes, in moments of absolute honesty, I wonder if part of me wants it to. If the hunger for transcendence that brought me to Alaska still whispers beneath my hard-won caution. If someday, when my human life approaches its natural end, I might revisit the choice offered in that shattered cabin during the long Alaskan night. For now, I patrol the boundary between worlds, neither fully accepting nor completely rejecting the knowledge these woods have given me. Marked but not transformed, witnessed but not consumed, at least not yet. So, if you're ever in Elkland, Iowa, keep your head down and don't make eye contact with anyone named Clevis. That was the advice from the retired sheriff who left me in charge of this tiny, forgettable town back in 2003. Yeah, I remember it because the warning was odd as hell. Clevis was apparently some kind of local legend, a family that owned half the farmland in town, and they were known for their eccentricities. My name's Leon Delaney. Been in law enforcement most of my adult life, but this job in Elkland is different. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, so the quiet in this place used to drive me nuts. I wasn't used to not hearing sirens or some guy yelling about his bad luck. But hey, I learned to appreciate the stillness after a while. You start to realize how much noise you carry around in your own head. Anyway, back to Clevis. I didn't think much of the old sheriff's warning. I chalked it up to small-town folklore. Every place has one of those families, right? The don't go up to the old mansion on the hill kind of crap. At first I let it slide, but I've been here long enough now to realize when something's off. Sheriff Miller, grizzled old bastard with a permanent squint like he was always looking into the sun, handed me the keys to the department cruiser, a weathered Ford that had seen better days sometime in the previous decade. The paint was peeling in places, revealing patches of rust beneath like poorly healed wounds. 22 years I've worn this badge, Miller said, his voice rough as sandpaper. Never lost a night's sleep over anything except those Clevis folks. I nodded, not really paying attention. I'd heard plenty of these small-town ghost stories before. They ain't right, Delaney, he continued, his eyes suddenly intense. Their land starts at the North Creek and runs about 4 miles up toward the county line. You get a call out that way, you take backup. Always. I remember laughing. What'd they do? Forget to pay their property taxes? Miller didn't laugh. Just heed the warning, son. Some things in this world don't make sense, and those people are one of them. The first few months passed uneventfully. I got to know the regulars at Rosie's Diner, the morning coffee crowd who'd stare at me like I was some exotic animal from the zoo, city cop in farm country. I'd nod and smile, slowly earning their trust through proximity, if nothing else. The town itself was unremarkable. One main street with faded storefronts, a post office that doubled as the town's gossip hub, and miles of farmland stretching in every direction. Population 1,826, according to the peeling sign at the town limits, though I suspected that number hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. It was during my 3rd month that I first heard the whispers about the Clevis family. I was having lunch at Rosie's when I overheard 2 farmers talking in hushed tones. Saw lights up at the Clevis place last night, one said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ain't nobody lived there proper since old man Ezekiel died in a '98, the other replied. Someone's there. Heard noises too, like animals, but not quite right. They noticed me listening and clammed up immediately. When I asked Rosie about it later, she busied herself wiping down the already spotless counter. We don't talk much about them folks, she said finally. Bad luck. That night I drove out past the North Creek, just to see the place for myself. The road narrowed as it wound through dense woods, the trees pressing in close on both sides like curious onlookers. As the forest thinned, I saw it in the distance, the Clevis farmhouse, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even from the road, I could tell it was a mess, listing to one side like a drunk about to topple over. The windows were dark, empty sockets in a skull-like facade. The surrounding land was overgrown, reclaiming what had once been orderly fields. I didn't drive closer. Something about the place made me uneasy, though I couldn't have explained why. As months turned into a year, the Clevis house became something of an obsession. I'd catch myself driving by it on patrol, always maintaining distance, never stopping. The locals noticed my interest but didn't comment. They'd just exchange glances, a silent communication I wasn't privy to. I started digging through old case files in the station's basement, a damp room full of cardboard boxes that smelled of mildew and neglect. The records went back decades, handwritten reports detailing everything from petty theft to domestic disputes. Scattered throughout were incidents involving the Clevis family, though most were vague. Livestock found mutilated near their property, hikers going missing in the woods surrounding their land, only to turn up weeks later with no memory of where they'd been. Strange sounds reported by neighbors. One file from 1976 caught my attention. A teenage boy had been found wandering along the highway, covered in blood that wasn't his own. When questioned, he could only repeat one phrase, "They ain't people." The boy was sent to a psychiatric facility in Des Moines and never returned to Elkland. By the summer of 2004, I'd convinced myself that the town's fear was irrational, a superstition that had taken hold generations ago and never let go. I even mentioned this to Miller when he stopped by the station one afternoon. "You still haven't been out to their place, have you?" he asked. "Driven by," I admitted. "Place looks abandoned." Miller shook his head. "They come back, always do, like the seasons." He wouldn't elaborate further. Then, in October of that year, 3 hunting dogs belonging to a farmer named Russell Baines disappeared near the Clevis property. A week later, their collars were found neatly arranged on Baines's front porch. The dogs themselves were never seen again. I filed a report, but there wasn't much to investigate. No witnesses, no evidence of who might have taken the animals or returned the collars. But it was enough to keep me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my small rented house, wondering what exactly was happening in Elkland, Iowa. It was August of 2005 when I got a call from Mayor Oldman. Nice guy, though his hairpiece is more crooked than his politics. He asked me to go check on some teenagers who'd been camping out by the creek just north of the Clevis farm. Said he hadn't heard from them in a couple of days. Now this town ain't big, so you can bet when kids go missing, folks get nervous. The mayor's voice had that forced calm people use when they're trying not to panic. "Probably nothing, Leon. Kids being kids, you know. But Michael Reeves called my office this morning. His boy Corey and 3 friends went camping up by North Creek on Monday. They were supposed to be back yesterday. None of them are answering their phones. I took down the details. 4 teenagers, all local kids between 16 and 17. Corey Reeves, Amber Wilson, Kyle Bennett, and Jack Morris. Good kids from what I knew, not the type to cause trouble. They told their parents they were camping at a spot by the creek, a popular hangout about half a mile from the Clevis property line. The creek wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute drive from the station. I headed out immediately, the cruiser kicking up dust on the unpaved road leading into the wooded area north of town. The day was oppressively hot, the kind of August heat that hangs in the air like a physical presence. Sweat beaded on my forehead before I'd even stepped out of the air-conditioned car. When I pulled up, I spotted their 2 tents still standing. No sign of the kids. Nothing looked disturbed, but there was this weird smell in the air, kind of like wet dirt, but sharper. You don't forget a smell like that. The campsite looked recently occupied. A small fire pit with blackened wood, coolers full of sodas and beer. I'd have to talk to them about that later. Even a portable speaker sitting on a log. Their backpacks were still in the tents, clothes and sleeping bags laid out as if they expected to return. I called out their names, my voice sounding hollow against the backdrop of chirping insects and rustling leaves. The only response was the gentle gurgling of the creek about 50 yards away. I decided to walk around and see if I could spot anything. Footprints, maybe. Something to give me an idea where these kids wandered off to. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see multiple sets of prints leading in various directions. Toward the creek, into the woods, back toward the road. Nothing immediately suspicious. That's when I saw the Cleavy's house, looming about half a mile from where the tents were set up. Now, I don't spook easy, but there's something about that place. Even from a distance, it looks wrong, like the earth itself is trying to push it away. From this vantage point, I could see details I'd missed from the road. The sagging porch, the broken windows, patched with what looked like animal hides, the strange symbols carved into the door frames. A thin trail of smoke rose from a chimney despite the summer heat, confirming what I'd suspected. Someone was living there. I decided to check the creek first. Following the most defined set of footprints, I made my way through a narrow path in the underbrush. The smell grew stronger as I approached the water, that earthy, metallic scent that seemed to coat the back of my throat. As I got closer, I found something worse than a couple of wayward teenagers. One of the kids, Jack Morris, according to his wallet, was lying face down in the mud near the creek, just out of sight from the campsite. His back was slashed open like someone had taken a rake to it, skin hanging loose and blood soaking into the ground. It looked fresh. I've seen plenty of crime scenes, but this was something else. It didn't make sense. Who the hell does this out here? The wounds didn't look like anything an animal would make. Too deliberate, too patterned. 5 parallel gashes running from his shoulders to his lower back, deep enough to expose bone in places. His face was pressed into the mud, arms outstretched as if he'd been crawling away from something. I called it in immediately. Backup was a couple of hours away, and I was stuck, standing in this nightmare by myself. Something felt off, though, something beyond just the murder. That smell from earlier? It was stronger now, and I swear it was coming from the direction of the Clevis property. I've always believed that gut instincts are worth more than people give them credit for. And my gut told me whatever did this to Jack wasn't done yet. I drew my weapon and continued searching the area, moving in a widening spiral from Jack's body. About 20 yards upstream, I found a girl's sneaker, white with pink laces crusted with dried mud. A little further, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. The cloth was stained dark, and I didn't need a lab to tell me it was blood. The trail led deeper into the woods, away from the creek and toward, of course, the Clevis property. I paused, weighing my options. Protocol said I should secure the scene and wait for backup. But 3 kids were still missing, and if what happened to Jack was any indication, they didn't have time to wait. I followed the trail, careful to note landmarks so I could find my way back. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and the air became thick, almost resistant, as if the woods themselves were trying to impede my progress. The smell grew more intense, that mixture of wet earth and copper, with something else underlying it. Something rotten. I pulled my shirt collar up over my nose, but it did little to help. After about 15 minutes of careful progress, the trees thinned slightly, and I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me cold. A crude structure stood in the center, not quite a building, more like a framework of branches and bones lashed together with what looked like strips of leather. Animal skulls hung from the crossbeams, and the ground beneath was dark with stains that formed irregular patterns. Scattered around this macabre shrine were personal items I recognized from the campsite: a blue windbreaker, a pair of glasses, a silver charm bracelet, possessions of the missing teenagers. I approached cautiously, my gun ready. The structure creaked despite the absence of wind, as if something was moving inside it. I circled around, trying to get a better view without getting too close. That's when I saw the second body. Kyle Bennett was propped against the far side of the structure, his eyes open but clouded, his throat torn out completely. Unlike Jack, Kyle's body had been positioned deliberately, his hands folded in his lap, his head tilted back as if gazing at the sky. A crown of twisted branches sat askew on his matted hair. Fighting the urge to vomit, I backed away. This wasn't just murder, this was ritual. And whatever sick individual was responsible clearly wasn't finished. 2 teenagers were still unaccounted for, and I had to find them before they ended up like their friends. I was so focused on the grisly scene before me that I almost missed the sound. A soft whimper coming from somewhere to my left. I turned, scanning the underbrush. There, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, was a flash of yellow, Amber Wilson's raincoat. "Amber?" I called softly, approaching slowly. "It's Sheriff Delaney. I'm here to help." The log shifted slightly as the girl pressed herself further into hiding. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They'll hear you." I crouched down, holstering my weapon to appear less threatening. "It's okay, you're safe now. Come on out." She emerged cautiously, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her clothes torn and bloodied. She looked at me with eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," she said urgently. "They'll be back soon. They always come back after dark." "Who, Amber? Who did this to Jack and Kyle?" She shook her head violently. "Not who. What? They're not right. We shouldn't have come here. Corey knew better. He knew the stories." "Where is Corey now?" I asked, helping her to her feet. She was trembling so badly I thought she might collapse. "They took him," she said, her voice breaking. "To the house. They said he was special. Different blood, they said. Better flavor." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Amber, I need you to focus. Who are they?" She looked at me as if I was stupid. "The Clevis family. They've been hunting here for generations. That's what Corey's grandfather told him. But we didn't believe it. We thought it was just a story. Now let me tell you something about small towns. People know more than they let on. You walk into any diner and you can hear the rumors floating around like they're part of the damn air. Elkland was no different. I'd heard whispers about the Clevis family, how they never showed up to town meetings, how they kept to themselves, and how people who had bad run-ins with them always seemed to end up missing or dead. But a rumor is just a rumor until you see blood in the dirt. I got Amber back to my cruiser as quickly as possible, radioing ahead to update the backup team and request medical assistance. The girl was in shock, alternating between vacant stares and sudden bursts of panic. I wrapped her in an emergency blanket from my trunk and gave her water, which she gulped down desperately. "We need to wait for backup before we go after Corey," I told her, though every instinct screamed at me to head straight for the Clevis house. "It'll be too late," Amber whispered. "They only keep them alive until sundown. That's what they told Kyle before they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Amber, I need to know everything you saw, everything they said." She closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the memories. "We were swimming in the creek. Corey heard something in the woods and went to check it out. We thought it was probably a deer or something. He didn't come back for a long time, so Jack went to look for him. Then we heard Jack scream." She took a shuddering breath. "Kyle told me to stay put while he went to find them. I was scared, so I hid in one of the tents. That's when they came, 3 of them moving so fast. They grabbed Kyle before he could even yell. I ran. I just ran." "What did they look like, Amber?" "Thin, so thin, like they were starving but strong. And their teeth," she shuddered. "Not normal, like they'd been filed down to points. They were pale, like they never saw the sun, and they smelled like decay." I thought about the case files I'd read, the stories I'd heard around town. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. "Did you see where they took Corey?" She nodded. "To the house. I followed them part of the way. I heard them talking. They said something about saving him for the ceremony, that he had the right blood. Old blood, they called it. I made a decision then that probably went against every protocol in the book. Amber, I'm going to get you somewhere safe, and then I'm going to find Corey." "You can't go alone," she said, suddenly grabbing my arm. You don't understand what they are. I'm trained for this, I assured her, though that was a lie. Nothing in my years on the Chicago force had prepared me for whatever the hell was happening in Elkland. I drove Amber to the station, where Doris, my part-time dispatcher, took her in with wide-eyed horror as I explained the situation. I called the mayor and told him to alert the families, then grabbed extra ammunition and a shotgun from the weapons locker. Backup's still an hour out, Doris reminded me. You sure you don't want to wait? I thought about what Amber had said, until sundown. The late summer sky was already starting to deepen toward evening. No time, I said. But if I'm not back or haven't called in by dark, you tell them to bring everything they've got to the Clevis place. Before heading out, I made one more stop, at the local library. Mary Winters, the elderly librarian, looked up in surprise as I burst through the door. Sheriff Delaney, is everything all right? I need information, Mary, everything you have on the Clevis family, now. To her credit, she asked no questions. She simply nodded and led me to a small room at the back of the library, unlocking a cabinet labeled Local History. Most of it's just folklore, she said as she pulled out a dusty folder. But some of the older records might help. I scanned through the documents quickly. Land deeds dating back to the 1860s, newspaper clippings yellowed with age, handwritten accounts from early settlers. A pattern emerged from the fragmented history. The Clevis family had been in Elkland since its founding, always living on the same plot of land, always keeping to themselves. Every few decades, reports would surface of strange occurrences near their property, followed by disappearances. Then the family would vanish for a time, only to return years later as if nothing had happened. One account from 1891 caught my attention, a doctor's notes regarding a Clevis child brought to him with an unusual condition. The youth presents with abnormal dentition, the canines and incisors being severely elongated and sharp to touch. The skin is remarkably pallid despite extensive exposure to sun. Most concerning is the diet the mother reports. The child refuses all normal sustenance, instead consuming only raw meat and, disturbingly, shows preference for blood. Mary watched as I read. There's more, she said quietly. Local legend says they aren't entirely human, that they made some kind of pact with something dark back in the old country, traded their humanity for long life, but they need fresh blood to maintain it. I looked up sharply. You believe that? She shrugged. I believe they've been here longer than should be possible. The names in those records, they repeat. Ezekiel, Jebediah, Malachi. Same names, generation after generation, and their faces. She pulled out a series of photographs. These span almost 100 years. The faces staring back at me from those faded images were unnervingly similar. The same gaunt cheekbones, hollow eyes, thin lips pulled back to reveal two perfect teeth. It could have been the same people photographed decades apart. Why hasn't anyone done anything? I demanded. If everyone knows. Fear, Mary said simply, and an unspoken agreement. They stay on their land, we stay on ours. When they get hungry, well, sometimes hikers go missing. Out-of-towners, people passing through, the town looks the other way. But these are local kids, I said. Mary's face hardened. Then they've broken the agreement, and may heaven help us all. I thanked her and left, my mind racing. What she'd told me was impossible, of course. Some kind of mass delusion, a mythology built up around an eccentric, possibly dangerous family. But those photographs, the repeating names, the consistency of the stories over more than a century. As I drove back toward the North Woods, the sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. I had maybe an hour of daylight left. I knew I had to get to the Clevis farm. As I walked up that dirt road, everything felt wrong. The house was old, falling apart in places, with its roof sagging like it was giving up on life. Out of habit, I put my hand on my gun, not expecting I'd need it, but not feeling right without the weight of it. Halfway to the front door, I saw movement, something darting between the trees just out of my peripheral vision. It was fast, but not like an animal. I approached cautiously, every sense heightened. The yard was overgrown with weeds and brambles that seemed to catch at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. The windows of the house were filthy, some broken and patched with various materials: wood, metal, what looked disturbingly like stretched animal hide. The front porch creaked ominously as I stepped onto it, the wood soft with rot in places. Old wind chimes made from what appeared to be small bones clattered in the faint breeze. The door was adorned with strange markings, not graffiti, but deliberate carvings that formed patterns I didn't recognize. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Sheriff's Department." No answer, of course. That's when I tried the door. It creaked open, and that smell hit me full force. Inside, the house was worse than I imagined. The place was dark, and the air felt thick, almost viscous, as if I was moving through something more substantial than mere atmosphere. The smell was overwhelming. That same earthy, metallic odor from the woods, but concentrated, mixed with the stench of decay and something else, something acidic that burned my nostrils. There were broken chairs, bits of wood strewn across the floor, and get this, a damn butcher's block right in the middle of the living room. Not the kind you'd expect to see in a kitchen, but a big stained one, with deep grooves worn into the surface from decades of use. The wood was dark with old stains, the surface carved with countless cuts. Around it, the floorboards were similarly discolored, the wood grain raised and warped as if it had absorbed gallons of liquid over the years. I didn't want to think about what kind of liquid that might be. The deeper I went into the house, the more bizarre it got. The walls were lined with old photos, all of people who looked like they belonged in a different century. The same high, gaunt cheekbones, hollow cheeks, and sharp features. I couldn't tell if it was the lighting or my nerves, but I swear they all had the same damn expression, like they were watching me. A collection of tools hung on one wall: knives, saws, hooks, all showing signs of frequent use. Their handles were worn smooth, the metal polished from handling. None of them were modern. They looked like antiques, hand-forged rather than mass-produced. I moved deeper into the house, calling out Corey's name. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, leaving no echo. The layout was confusing. Hallways that should have led to other rooms instead looped back on themselves, doors opening to reveal brick walls or steep staircases that led nowhere. In what must have been a dining room, I found a long table set for a meal. The plates were empty but stained, glasses filled with a dark liquid I had no intention of identifying. The chairs were mismatched, some ornate antiques, others simple wooden stools. One chair at the head of the table was noticeably larger than the others, its arms and legs carved with the same strange symbols I'd seen on the front door. A pantry off the dining room contained jars of preserved meats and what looked like organs floating in cloudy liquid. Labels written in faded ink identified contents I couldn't bring myself to read too closely. The shelves were organized with meticulous care, each jar equidistant from its neighbors, labels facing outward. I continued my search, moving upstairs. Each step groaned under my weight, threatening to give way. The upper floor was even darker than the first, the windows here completely covered with heavy cloth that blocked all natural light. A sudden, loud crash came from upstairs, and my heart did this thing where it tried to jump out of my chest. I pulled my gun just in case and started toward the staircase. Every step groaned under my weight, and halfway up I heard voices. No, not voices. One voice laughing. A deep, raspy laugh that made my skin crawl. At the top of the stairs, there was only one door. I braced myself and kicked it open. There he was, Jeb Clevis, naked to the waist, smeared in what looked like mud, though I had a sick feeling it wasn't mud. His body was gaunt, every rib showing, and his hands were wet. His eyes met mine, and he smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "Found you," he rasped. Then he lunged. I barely got a shot off before he was on me. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, the impact spinning him slightly. But he didn't slow down. He slammed into me with impossible force, his skin cold against mine despite the summer heat. We crashed through the railing, and I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. My gun skittered away out of reach. Jeb was fast, faster than anyone that thin should be. His hands were around my throat before I could even think about moving, squeezing the life out of me. It wasn't the first time I'd been in a chokehold, but this was different. There was something inhuman about his strength. His fingers felt like steel bands against my windpipe, and his face was inches from mine, those sharpened teeth bared in a grotesque grin. His breath smelled of rot and copper, washing over me in hot waves as he leaned closer. "You shouldn't have come, lawman," he hissed, his voice a dry rasp like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "This ain't your business. The town knows better." Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I struggled for air. Desperate, I grabbed a shard of wood from the broken railing and jammed it into his side. He howled, a high-pitched screech that sounded more animal than human, and let go just enough for me to scramble out from under him. I wasn't going to wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the door, grabbing my gun on the way out, and ran toward my car. But as I reached the porch, I saw them. 4 more Clevises, all standing in the yard, watching me with the same cold, sharp teeth bared in unnatural grins. They looked more animal than human, their movements jerky and unsettling. 2 males and 2 females, all with the same gaunt build and pallid skin. Their clothes were mismatched and outdated, as if cobbled together from different eras. They formed a semicircle, blocking my path to the car. And there behind them was a pile. No, not a pile. Bodies. Pieces of them mangled and twisted like discarded toys. The missing kids. It was a trap from the start. In the center of the group stood a tall, elderly man who could only be Ezekiel Clevis. Despite his apparent age, he stood straight and strong, his white hair long and wild. He wore a tattered suit that might once have been formal, the fabric now stained and frayed. Around his neck hung a collection of small objects I initially mistook for charms or pendants, until I realized they were human teeth strung together like pearls. "Sheriff Delaney," he said, his voice surprisingly rich and cultured, "we've been expecting you. The town usually sends its sacrifice with more discretion." "Sacrifice?" I repeated, my hand tightening on my gun. Ezekiel's smile widened, revealing teeth identical to Jeb's, filed to sharp points. "Our arrangement with Elkland is quite simple, Sheriff. We provide protection, they provide sustenance. Every few years, a handful of outsiders go missing in these woods. Hikers, campers, people passing through, no one important." "These were local kids," I growled. "An unfortunate misunderstanding," Ezekiel conceded. "The boy, Corey is it, wandered onto our land. We took that as an offering. When his friends came looking..." He shrugged, as if the outcome had been inevitable. Behind me, I heard Jeb emerge from the house, his breathing labored but his footsteps steady. I was surrounded. "Where's Corey?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. Ezekiel's expression turned almost disappointed. "Still alive, if that's your concern. His bloodline is special to us, old blood. One of his ancestors made a pact with my grandfather. Such blood must be properly prepared for the ceremony." "Let him go," I said, raising my gun and pointing it at Ezekiel's head. "Let him go, and maybe I don't bring the entire state police down on this place." The Clevises laughed in unison, the sound like dry branches snapping. "Others have tried," Ezekiel said. "We've been here since before this town had a name, Sheriff. We'll be here long after it's forgotten." I was calculating my odds, 6 of them, 1 of me. I had my service weapon and the shotgun in my cruiser if I could reach it. The sun was setting, the shadows lengthening across the yard. According to Amber, that meant Corey's time was running out. Slowly, I began backing toward the car, keeping my gun trained on Ezekiel. The other Clevises tensed, their bodies coiling like springs about to release. "Stay back," I warned. "I don't want to shoot, but I will." Jeb made a hissing sound behind me. "He's scared, Pa. Smell the fear on him." "Of course he is," Ezekiel replied. "He should be. But fear makes the blood thin, doesn't it? Not ideal for the ceremony." That's when I heard it, a weak cry from somewhere inside the house. Corey was still alive. I made a split-second decision. I fired a shot at Ezekiel, not aiming to kill but to create a distraction. The bullet grazed his arm, and the family reacted instantly, lunging forward with inhuman speed. I turned and sprinted back into the house, slamming the door behind me and bracing it with a broken chair. It wouldn't hold them long, but I didn't need long. I just needed to find Corey. The cry had come from below. There must be a cellar or basement. I searched frantically, eventually finding a trapdoor hidden beneath a faded rug in what might have once been a kitchen. I pulled it open, revealing a steep staircase descending into darkness. I could hear the Clevises outside, surrounding the house, some trying the windows while others pounded on the door. The chair was already splintering. I had minutes at most. With no time for caution, I descended into the darkness, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the way. The steps were worn smooth, as if countless feet had traversed them over decades or centuries. The smell was worst here, a miasma of decay and that strange metallic scent that seemed to permeate everything connected to the Clevis family. The basement was a single large room with a dirt floor and stone walls. Ancient support beams, blackened with age, held up the ceiling. Suspended from these beams were hooks and chains, their purpose all too clear. The floor was marked with strange symbols drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room, Corey Reeves lay strapped to a stone table. His chest rose and fell weakly, but he was alive. Around him, candles made from yellowish wax cast eerie shadows on the walls. His shirt had been removed, and his torso was marked with the same symbols I'd seen throughout the house, painted onto his skin in a dark substance. I rushed to him, quickly checking his condition. He was pale and weak but conscious, his eyes widening in recognition when he saw me. Sheriff," he whispered. They're not human." "I know, kid," I said, working to unfasten the leather straps binding him. "We can discuss folklore later. Right now, we're getting out of here." Above us, I heard the chair finally give way, and the front door crash open. Heavy footsteps moved through the house, accompanied by that same dry, rasping laughter. "They're coming!" Corey gasped. "The sun's almost down. That's when they do the ceremony." I had him free now, helping him to his feet. He was weak, but could walk with support. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked. He nodded weakly. "There's a tunnel. They brought me through it. Leads out to the woods." We moved as quickly as Corey's condition allowed, toward a narrow opening in the far wall that I'd initially mistaken for a shadow. It was barely wide enough for a person to pass through, the ceiling so low we had to stoop. The earthen passage was shored up with wooden beams that looked centuries old, the dirt walls smooth from repeated contact. Behind us, I heard the trapdoor open and voices calling out. They'd found our escape route. "Move!" I urged Corey, practically carrying him now. The tunnel seemed endless, branching occasionally into side passages that disappeared into darkness. Without Corey to guide me, I would have been hopelessly lost. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw a faint glow ahead, natural light filtering through some kind of exit. We emerged into the woods as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, the forest around us plunging into twilight. Corey collapsed against a tree, his breathing labored. We were somewhere in the woods, presumably not far from the Clevis property, but in the growing darkness it was impossible to get my bearings. "We need to keep moving," I told him, checking my phone. No signal, of course. "They'll be coming," Corey said, his voice barely audible. "They can smell blood, and I'm bleeding." I looked closer and saw he was right. A slow trickle of blood seeped from cuts on his chest where the symbols had been carved into his skin, not just painted as I'd initially thought. In the distance, I heard it. That high-pitched, inhuman screeching that could only be the Clevis family on the hunt. They were coming for us. "Come on," I urged, helping Corey to his feet. "We need to find the road." We stumbled through the darkening forest, every shadow seeming to move, every cracking twig sounding like a gunshot. I kept my weapon ready, though I wasn't sure how effective it would be against whatever the Clevises truly were. The screeching grew closer, sometimes seeming to come from all directions at once. They were toying with us, I realized. They knew these woods better than I ever could. This was their hunting ground. Then I saw it, a flash of light through the trees. The road. My cruiser couldn't be far. "Almost there," I told Corey. "Just a little." A shape dropped from the trees directly in front of us. One of the female Clevises, her body contorted in a way no humans should be able to move. She landed in a crouch, then straightened slowly. Her movements fluid yet somehow wrong, like watching a spider move with human-like grace. "The boy belongs to us," she said, her voice a high, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. "The pact was made generations ago. His blood seals it for another century. I raised my gun. Back off, now. She tilted her head at an impossible angle, studying me with cold, calculating eyes. You would die for him? A boy you barely know? If I have to, I replied. She seemed to find this amusing, her lipless mouth stretching into a grin that revealed those same sharpened teeth. Brave, foolish, but brave. Perhaps we'll keep parts of you as trophies. In one fluid motion, she launched herself at me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I fired instinctively, the shot catching her mid-leap. She twisted in the air, screeching in pain or rage or both, but still managed to slam into me, knocking us both to the ground. Her hands, cold and impossibly strong, closed around my throat for the second time that night. Her face was inches from mine, those teeth poised to tear at my flesh. I struggled, but her strength was overwhelming. Then, suddenly, her weight was lifted off me. Corey, finding strength from somewhere, had smashed a heavy branch against her head. She lay stunned, momentarily motionless. We didn't wait to see if she recovered. We ran, bursting through the tree line onto the road. My cruiser sat where I'd left it, its solid presence the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. "Get in," I shouted to Corey, fumbling for my keys. As we peeled away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, the entire Clevis family standing at the edge of the woods, watching us go. They made no move to pursue, but their stillness was somehow more terrifying than any chase could have been. They didn't chase me as I sped away, blood pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was back at the station. I made the call to state police and told them about the bodies, about the Clevises, about the horror I'd just seen. The feds came. They found the bodies. But Jeb Clevis and his family, they were gone. The house was empty. They found the blood, sure, but no Clevises. The next few days passed in a blur of official statements, evidence collection, and bureaucratic red tape. State police swarmed the Clevis property, meticulously documenting everything. They found exactly what I'd described: the bizarre implements in the house, the butcher's block, the cellar with its stone table and ritual markings. They found the bodies of Jack Morris and Kyle Bennett, their remains confirming the brutal manner of their deaths. What they didn't find was any trace of the Clevis family. The house stood empty, as if no one had lived there for years. There were no personal belongings, no indication of where they might have gone. Even the photographs I'd seen lining the walls had vanished. "It's like they just evaporated," said Agent Reed, the lead investigator from the State Bureau. "People don't just disappear like that." But they had, and deep down I wasn't surprised. Mary Winter's words echoed in my head. They vanish for a time, only to return years later as if nothing had happened. Corey Reeves recovered physically, though the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. The symbols carved into his chest left permanent scars, their meaning a mystery that multiple experts in occult symbology failed to decipher. He couldn't explain much about his time in captivity. He'd been drugged for most of it, aware only of preparations being made for some kind of ritual that was to take place at sundown. Amber Wilson's testimony corroborated mine, though she'd seen less of the Clevis family than I had. The official report concluded that we'd encountered a group of deranged killers who had been living in isolation, developing their own twisted mythology and rituals. The report made no mention of their inhuman strength, their impossible speed, or the fact that they'd apparently been in Elkland for generations. Science and reason prevailed in the official narrative. A manhunt was organized, APBs were issued, but no trace of the Clevis family was ever found. Life in Elkland changed after that summer. The invisible boundary that had kept the town separate from the Clevis territory for generations was gone. The North Woods were thoroughly searched, the old house eventually condemned and torn down. New families moved into town, unaware of its dark history. The old-timers who knew the truth kept quiet, perhaps out of shame for their complicity in the unspoken arrangement that had allowed the Clevis family to prey on outsiders for so long. Mayor Oldman resigned, citing health concerns. Mary Winters retired from the library, moving to Arizona to live with her daughter. Sheriff Miller, when I visited him to share what had happened, listened in silence, then simply nodded as if I'd confirmed something he'd known all along. "They'll be back," was all he said. Not in your lifetime, maybe, but they'll be back. I stayed on as sheriff for another 5 years, watching as Elkland slowly transformed from a secretive, insular community to a more open one. The North Woods were eventually developed into a small subdivision, affordable housing for commuters working in larger towns nearby. The creek where we'd found Jack Morris became a popular spot for family picnics. Life moved on. I never went back to that house, and I never found out exactly what they were. Part of me doesn't want to know, but the smell, the one from the creek in the house, it never left my nose. Even now, after all these years, I can still catch a whiff of it sometimes when I'm driving by the old farmland, like a reminder. And no one else ever went missing in Elkland again. At least not while I was sheriff. I left in 2010, moved back to Chicago, tried to put the whole thing behind me. I married, had kids, built a normal life. But I keep tabs on Elkland. Old habits die hard, I guess. And every few years, I notice a pattern in the local news. Hikers going missing in the woods near the county line, just beyond where Elkland's borders end. The cases are never solved. The families never get closure. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night. That smell, wet earth and copper, filling my nostrils even though I'm hundreds of miles away from Elkland. I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the Clevises have returned, if they've found a new arrangement with whatever community they're haunting now. And I wonder if I should have done more somehow, if I should have found a way to end it permanently. But how do you kill something that might not be entirely alive to begin with? Something that's been feeding on human fear and flesh for generations? So I'll leave you with the same warning I got when I first came to Elkland. If you're ever in those parts, keep your head down and don't make eye contact with anyone named Clevis. And if you smell wet earth and copper, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because they remember me, I'm sure of it, and they're patient. They have all the time in the world. Somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, there's a 2-lane highway that never seems to end. Just asphalt stretching out like a thread through miles of flat, empty land. This was where I found myself, driving a rig loaded with grain. No one else wanted to make the run, probably because it was so damn lonely. But I was never one to shy away from isolation. I took it, figured it would give me some peace of mind. I've been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades now. It suits me. Just me, the road, and an engine that hums as steady as the thoughts in my head. Sure, I've seen some wild stuff in my time, but nothing ever stuck with me. It's like being on the road strips you of those things. You just move on to the next job, the next delivery. This particular stretch of highway, though, it did something to me. Still think about it now and then, late at night when the world goes quiet. The early October morning was mild, the sun barely cresting the horizon as I fired up the engine of my Peterbilt. The terminal manager, Russo, had given me the paperwork with a look that said he was glad it wasn't him making the trip. 300 miles of nothing but corn and sky, Green, he said, scratching his beard. You sure you want this run? I just shrugged. Money's the same whether the view's pretty or not. Russo laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Yeah, well, some of the boys refuse to take that route anymore. Say it gets to them somehow. You believe in ghost stories, Russo? I asked, tucking the paperwork into my jacket. I believe in keeping my sanity, he replied. That stretch of road, there's something about the emptiness that messes with your head. I've never been one for superstition. 20 years on the road teaches you that most fears are just your mind playing tricks. Loneliness does things to people. Makes them see what isn't there, hear things in the wind that's just wind. I've known drivers who quit because they couldn't handle the solitude. Said they started seeing shadows moving in the rear view. Not me. I find comfort in being alone. At least I used to. The first few hours on the road were uneventful. I had the radio on, playing some old Johnny Cash tunes. The landscape rolled by, endless cornfields swaying in the autumn breeze. There's a hypnotic quality to driving across the Great Plains, the horizon never changing. Just miles of sameness. You get lost in your head. Around noon, I pulled into a small truck stop for fuel and coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for a few locals having lunch at the counter. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, filled my thermos without saying much. Long way to Kansas City, she said finally, glancing at my manifest sitting on the counter. Long way anywhere from here, I replied. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Be careful out there. Strange things happen on that stretch. I almost asked her what she meant, but decided against it. Every region has its local legends, its boogeyman stories. I'd heard them all before. Back on the road, the sky turned overcast, clouds rolling in from the west. The sudden dimness made everything look gray and lifeless. Perfect for driving, I thought. No distractions, just me and the road. But as the miles ticked by, I started to feel a growing unease. Nothing I could put my finger on, just a sensation, like being watched. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but empty road behind me, stretching back to the horizon. I turned the radio up louder, trying to drown out the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. It was around 3 in the afternoon when I first noticed the vehicle. Just a speck in my mirror at first, a small dark shape on the road far behind me. Nothing unusual about that. Other vehicles use these roads after all. But as the minutes passed, I realized the distance between us wasn't changing. Not getting closer, not falling behind, just maintaining the same gap, like it was tethered to my truck by an invisible line. By 4 o'clock, I could make out that it was a pickup truck, old, dark-colored, keeping pace about a quarter-mile back. The highway had been empty for miles, no exits, no towns, nowhere for anyone to go except straight ahead on this ribbon of asphalt. Probably just heading the same way, I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the cab. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. The way it maintained that exact distance, never varying, never making a move to pass despite the empty road ahead. I took a swig of coffee, now cold and bitter. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the fields. In the gathering darkness, the headlights of the pickup glowed like patient eyes. I tried to dismiss the growing anxiety. Just another driver on a long, boring stretch of road. Nothing sinister about that. But my hands had tightened on the wheel, and I realized I was going 10 miles over the speed limit. I eased off the gas, watching the speedometer drop. In my mirror, the pickup slowed too. Exact same pace, exact same distance. That's when the first real chill settled into my bones. For the next hour, I tried to rationalize the situation. Coincidence. Maybe they were following the speed of my taillights, using me as a guide. Maybe I was overthinking the whole thing. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more aware I became of that constant presence behind me. As darkness fell completely, I flipped on the high beams, trying to penetrate the gloom that had settled across the landscape. The fields on either side of the highway seemed to absorb the light, creating a tunnel effect, just me, my headlights, and a narrow strip of visible road disappearing into blackness ahead. And behind me, those unwavering headlights, never closer, never farther away. I reached for my phone, but the signal had disappeared miles back. Out here in the vast emptiness of rural Nebraska, I was alone. Alone except for whatever was following me. The planned pit stop at the junction ahead couldn't come soon enough. Civilization, other people, bright lights. That's what I needed. The junction was just a small roadside gas station and diner, but it would be enough. The glowing sign appeared in the distance, a beacon in the darkness. Relief washed over me as I signaled and began to slow. In my mirror, the pickup's turn signal flashed on as well. The gas station's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the empty parking lot. Just 2 other vehicles, a battered station wagon and a semi parked for the night. I pulled my rig up to the diesel pump, glancing in my mirrors as I set the brake. The pickup truck turned in behind me, rolling slowly past the pumps, before parking at the far end of the lot, headlights extinguished. In the sudden darkness, I couldn't make out the driver, just the silhouette of the vehicle. An old Ford, maybe from the late 80s. Its once blue paint faded to a dull gray. I stepped down from my cab, stretching my legs after hours of driving. The night air had turned cold, carrying the scent of distant rain. The silence out here was absolute. No traffic noise, no city hum, just the occasional creak of my cooling engine and the hollow whistle of wind across the flat landscape. The station attendant, a kid no older than 20 with acne-scarred cheeks, nodded at me through the window. I waved back, trying to appear casual as I began refueling. All the while I kept my gaze fixed on the pickup, waiting for the driver to emerge. No one did. "You see that pickup come in?" I asked the attendant while paying for the fuel. He glanced up from his phone, looking past me to the parking lot. "That old Ford?" "Yeah, pulls in here sometimes. Guy never comes inside, though." "You know who he is?" The kid shrugged. "Local, maybe. Don't pay much attention. A lot of strange folks pass through." I bought a fresh coffee and a shrink-wrapped sandwich, then headed back to my truck. The diner attached to the gas station looked closed, its windows dark except for a single light above the door. As I climbed back into my cab, I noticed movement from the pickup, a figure shifting in the driver's seat. Still, no one emerged. I sat in my idling truck, eating the tasteless sandwich and considering my options. I could wait here, maybe try to sleep in the cab until morning. But that would put me behind schedule, and I had always prided myself on timely deliveries. The logical part of me said the whole thing was ridiculous. Just my imagination turning an ordinary coincidence into something sinister. 20 minutes later, I pulled back onto the highway, headlights cutting through the darkness. In my mirror, I watched the pickup's lights flick on. It followed me out of the lot, resuming its position a quarter-mile back. "All right," I muttered. "Let's see how committed you are." I increased my speed, pushing well above the limit. The pickup matched me. I slowed to a crawl. It slowed too. I tried varying my speed randomly. The pickup adjusted each time, maintaining that exact same distance. My heart pounded against my ribs. This wasn't normal behavior. This wasn't coincidence. Whatever, whoever, was behind me was deliberately following. I tried to think rationally. Highway robbers? No, they would have made their move at the gas station. Cops? Unmarked vehicles usually give themselves away sooner or later, and besides, they would have pulled me over already if they had cause. Some kind of prank? Seemed elaborate for a joke, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. The miles continued to unroll beneath my wheels. I passed a sign indicating my turnoff was 50 miles ahead. Not that far, in trucker terms. I could make it without stopping again. Whatever this game was, it would end when I reached my destination. An hour passed. The pickup remained. The darkness outside the cab seemed to deepen, pressing in against the windows. I found myself checking the locks on the doors, something I rarely bothered with on the open road. Then I saw it. A side road appearing on the right, unpaved but wide enough for my rig. It wasn't on my route map, but at that moment I didn't care. I needed to know if this was really happening. Without signaling, I cut the wheel hard, braking sharply as I took the turn. The maneuver was dangerous with a full load, but I executed it cleanly. The dirt road led straight into darkness, no visible destination. I killed my headlights and pulled to a stop about 50 yards from the highway, cutting the engine. Then I waited, watching the road I'd just left, half expecting the pickup to continue on its way. It didn't. The vehicle slowed as it approached the turnoff, then followed my path, headlights sweeping across the dirt road. I ducked down in my seat, heart hammering as the pickup rolled slowly past my position, continuing down the road. Once it was a safe distance ahead, I quietly restarted my engine, executed a careful turnaround, and headed back to the highway. A brief moment of triumph surged through me. I'd shaken my pursuer. The feeling lasted exactly 6 minutes. I'd just settled back into my cruise speed when the headlights appeared in my mirror again. Impossible. There had been no other connecting roads. No way for the pickup to circle back and catch up so quickly. Yet there it was, maintaining that same distance, as if our brief detour had never happened. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I fumbled for my phone again, hoping against hope for a signal. Nothing. I was truly alone out here. "What do you want?" I shouted, though there was no one to hear me but myself. As if in response, the pickup's high beams flashed once, then returned to normal. My mouth went dry. For the next 2 hours, I drove in a state of heightened awareness, all senses focused on the road ahead and the presence behind. The few times other vehicles passed going the opposite direction, I considered flashing my lights or honking, trying to get their attention. But what would I say? That I was being followed? By a vehicle that hadn't made any aggressive moves, hadn't tried to run me off the road or otherwise threaten me. It was nearly midnight when I saw the sign for Starling Grain Elevator. It loomed on the horizon, a massive silhouette against the night sky. I'd passed it on previous runs, a relic from a bygone era, abandoned years ago when the railroad changed routes. The facility sat about half a mile off the highway, connected by a service road. In that moment, I made a decision. This had gone on long enough. Whatever was happening, I needed to confront it directly. I signaled and turned off the highway toward the grain elevator. The service road was rough, neglected for years. My rig bounced and swayed as I navigated the potholes. Behind me, the pickup followed, headlights bouncing with each bump in the road. The grain elevator complex was larger than it appeared from the highway, a central silo reaching up like a concrete finger, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and loading docks. Everything was in an advanced state of decay, windows broken, metal rusted, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. I pulled into what had once been the main yard, positioning my rig so the headlights illuminated the open area. Then I shut down the engine and reached under my seat for the lockbox. The .357 revolver inside was cold to the touch, loaded with 6 rounds. I hadn't fired it in years, but the familiar weight was reassuring as I slipped it into my jacket pocket. The pickup truck rolled into the yard behind me, its headlights catching dust motes swirling in the night air. It came to a stop about 30 yards away, engine still running, lights still burning. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened. I stood beside my truck, one hand in my pocket gripping the revolver, watching as a figure emerged from the pickup. The facility's abandoned yard stretched out between us, cracked concrete littered with decades of debris. The only sound was the idle of his engine and the distant moan of wind through the elevator's empty silo. He stepped fully into view, illuminated by his truck's headlights. My first coherent thought was how wrong he looked. The man was tall, easily 6'4", but unnaturally thin. His body seemed constructed of angles rather than curves, limbs too long for his torso, neck stretched like it had been pulled. He wore faded blue work clothes that hung from his frame, as if they belonged to someone much larger. His hair was long and lank, falling past his shoulders in greasy strands, but it was his face that made my stomach clench. Gaunt beyond mere thinness, his skin pulled so tight across his skull that it seemed ready to split at the cheekbones. His lips were bloodless cracks, his nose sharp and pronounced. His eyes, those eyes, were set deep in hollow sockets, yet somehow caught the light and reflected it back like an animal's. He began walking toward me, his gait smooth and unhurried, each step perfectly measured, perfectly timed. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a predator that knows its prey can't escape. "That's far enough," I called out when he'd closed half the distance. My voice echoed off the concrete structures around us. "What do you want?" He didn't answer, didn't change his pace, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken at all. "I'm armed," I warned, drawing the revolver but keeping it pointed at the ground. "Stop right there." Still, he advanced, 20 yards now, 15. I raised the gun, aiming at his chest. "Last warning, stop or I'll shoot." Not a flicker of concern crossed his face. No fear, no hesitation. Just that same measured walk, closing the gap between us with mechanical precision. 10 yards. My finger tightened on the trigger. "Stop." He didn't. The first shot cracked through the night, the sound amplified by the surrounding structures. The bullet struck him in the left shoulder, the impact visibly jerking his body sideways. Blood bloomed dark against the blue fabric of his shirt. He staggered slightly but didn't fall, didn't cry out. His expression remained unchanged as he regained his balance and continued forward. Shock froze me for a crucial second. I've seen men wounded before. They scream, they collapse, they clutch at the injury. They don't just keep walking like nothing happened. I fired again. This shot hit him squarely in the chest, dead center. It should have stopped him cold, dropped him where he stood. Instead, he merely rocked back on his heels, swayed for a moment, then resumed his advance. A wave of pure terror washed over me. This wasn't possible. No one takes a round to the center mass and keeps coming. But the evidence was right there before my eyes, closing the distance between us with each mechanical step. Panic took over. I emptied the revolver, 4 shots in rapid succession. Each bullet found its mark. 2 more in the chest, 1 in the stomach, one in the throat. Blood sprayed from the wounds, black in the harsh headlights. His body jerked and twitched with each impact, but his expression never changed, and his feet kept moving. 7 yards, 6, 5. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. I stood rooted to the spot, gun still extended, watching this impossibility approach. His shirt was soaked with blood now, torn open by the bullet's exit wounds. I could see ragged holes in his flesh, yet still he walked. 4 yards, 3. Then something changed. His movements became less coordinated, his steps faltering. At 2 yards distance, he stopped completely. For a moment, we stood facing each other. Me with my useless gun, him riddled with bullets that should have killed him instantly. His eyes found mine. There was awareness there, intelligence. Something cognizant looking out from behind those reflective orbs. His bloodless lips parted slightly as if he might speak. Instead, he collapsed. Not a gradual folding, but a sudden release, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the concrete with a sickening thud, limbs splayed at unnatural angles. I stood there, breathing hard, unable to process what had just happened. The revolver slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the ground. For several minutes, I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the fact that I had just shot a man multiple times and he had kept coming. Finally, caution overcame shock. I approached the fallen figure carefully, still half expecting him to rise again. He didn't move. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading across the cracked concrete. I crouched beside the body, my legs threatening to give way. Up close, the wrongness of him was even more apparent. His skin had an almost translucent quality, blue veins visible beneath the surface. And covering nearly every exposed inch of flesh were markings, strange symbols carved into his skin like scars. Some of the markings appeared old, healed into white ridges. Others seemed fresher, the edges still pink and raised. They formed no pattern I could recognize, not letters or numbers, but deliberate shapes that seemed to flow into each other across the terrain of his body. I reached out, hesitating before touching his wrist, searching for a pulse I knew wouldn't be there. His flesh was cold, much colder than it should have been for someone so recently alive. As I drew back my hand, I noticed something clutched in his. Prying open the rigid fingers, I found a scrap of paper, folded and refolded until it was no larger than a postage stamp. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. A name was written there. My name, Harlan Green. Nothing else. Just my name in spidery, cramped handwriting. The paper itself was worn thin at the creases, as if it had been opened and refolded countless times. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this man? Why had he followed me? How had he known my name? And most disturbing of all, how had he continued walking after taking multiple gunshots to vital areas? The distant wail of a siren cut through my thoughts. Someone must have heard the gunshots, perhaps a farmer or passer-by on the highway. I hadn't even considered calling the police myself, but now they were coming. I stood up, stepping back from the body. The revolver lay where I dropped it. I made no move to retrieve it. Instead, I walked to the grain elevator's office building, a small structure adjacent to the main silo. The door hung partially open, the lock long since broken. Inside, dust covered everything, desks, chairs, an ancient rotary phone mounted on the wall. To my surprise, the phone had a dial tone. I called 911, giving my location and a brief explanation. I'd been followed, confronted the person, and been forced to defend myself. The dispatcher told me to remain where I was, that officers were already en route. I returned to the yard, standing in the harsh glare of the pickup's headlights, which still burned despite everything. The body lay where it had fallen, a dark shape against the concrete. Blood continued to spread outward, reaching toward my boots, and I waited, trying not to look too closely at what I'd done, trying not to think about how he'd kept coming despite the bullets, trying not to wonder why my name was written on that scrap of paper. The sirens grew louder. The first police car arrived 14 minutes after my call, rolling into the yard with lights flashing but siren silent. A county sheriff's cruiser, dust-covered and battle-scarred. The deputy who stepped out was young, maybe mid-30s, with the weathered look of someone who patrols vast empty spaces. His name tag read, Mercer. He approached with his hand resting on his holstered weapon, eyes scanning the scene, my rig, the pickup truck with its headlights still burning, the body on the ground, me standing apart from it all. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," he said, voice steady but tense. I complied, raising my hands shoulder high. "The gun's over there," I said, nodding toward where the revolver lay. "I'm unarmed now." Mercer nodded but maintained his cautious approach. When he reached the body, he knelt briefly, checking for signs of life, though it was clearly a formality. "Nobody survives 5 bullet wounds like that." "You Harlan Green?" he asked, standing up again. "Yes, sir." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "The dispatcher said you called this in yourself. Said you were being followed?" I nodded, hands still raised. "For miles. I pulled in here to confront him. He wouldn't stop coming toward me. I warned him multiple times." Mercer studied me for a long moment, then slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. "All right, Mr. Green, you can lower your hands, but don't make any sudden movements. More units are on their way." Over the next hour, the abandoned grain facility transformed into an impromptu command center. 2 more patrol cars arrived, followed by a coroner's van and an unmarked sedan carrying a detective from the county seat. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the night breeze, stretching across the yard in haphazard patterns. I sat in the back of Mercer's cruiser, door open, feet on the ground outside. "Not under arrest," they assured me, "just the standard procedure while they sorted things out." I gave my statement 3 times, once to Mercer, once to the detective, a heavy-set man named Kerrigan, and once recorded formally for the report. Each time I tried to stick to the facts, though they seemed more impossible with each telling. Yes, I'd shot him multiple times. Yes, he had continued walking toward me afterward. No, I couldn't explain how that was possible. "Some people don't go down easy," Kerrigan said, scratching notes in a small pad. "Drugs, adrenaline, human body can withstand a lot more than you'd think." But I could tell he was troubled by the scene. The blood spatter didn't lie. The man had been shot from a distance, had continued walking, and had collapsed more than a minute later, based on the trail he'd left behind. While the coroner worked, Mercer approached me again. "We found ID on the body," he said, consulting his notebook. "Name's Jeffrey Marsh. Mean anything to you?" I shook my head. "Never heard that name before today." "Well, Mr. Marsh has quite a record. Mostly petty stuff 20 years back. Vagrancy, public intoxication, some minor assault charges. Nothing recent, though." Mercer frowned. "Last known address was a halfway house in Oklahoma, but that was 12 years ago. Been off the grid since then?" "Why was he following me?" I asked. "Why did he have my name?" Mercer looked up sharply. "What do you mean he had your name?" I told him about the folded paper I'd found clutched in Marsh's hand. The detective joined us as I explained, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Where's this paper now?" Kerrigan demanded. "I left it where it was, with him." The detective strode back to the body, speaking urgently with the coroner. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language conveyed confusion and concern. Kerrigan returned, holding a small evidence bag containing the unfolded paper. "This your name?" he asked, showing me the bag. I nodded. "That's it, exactly how I found it." The detective and Mercer exchanged glances. Something unspoken passed between them. "What?" I asked. "What is it?" "The rest of his belongings are pretty standard," Kerrigan said carefully. "Wallet, keys, a few dollars in cash. But we also found a notebook in his truck. It's unusual." "Unusual how?" Another glance between the officers. "It's filled with names," Mercer said finally. "Dozens of them, some crossed out, some circled, some with dates next to them." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. "My name, was it in there?" "Yes," Kerrigan admitted. "Circled, no date." "What does that mean?" I asked, but I could tell from their expressions that they didn't know either. The investigation continued through the night. Crime scene technicians arrived, photographing and documenting everything. The coroner's assistants finally removed the body around 3 a.m. I remained at the scene, answering the same questions repeatedly as new officials arrived. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy blanket. The yard looked different in the gray morning light, smaller, less menacing. The blood stain on the concrete had turned rust brown, already being scattered by the wind. Detective Kerrigan approached me one final time. "We're going to need you to come to the station to complete your statement," he said. "But based on the evidence and witness accounts, this appears to be a clear case of self-defense." "Witness accounts?" I asked, confused. "There wasn't anyone else here." Kerrigan hesitated. "We've had reports about Marsh before, nothing concrete, just sightings. People being followed on this stretch of highway. Never ended like this, though." "So I'm not the first," I said quietly. "No," the detective admitted, "but you might be the last." They allowed me to drive my own rig to the county sheriff's office, following behind in a patrol car. The morning was fully established by the time we arrived, the small-town station coming to life with the day shift. I gave my formal statement, signed the necessary papers, and surrendered my revolver for ballistics testing. A formality, they assured me, as there was no question about what had happened. They also took photographs of the scrapes on my knuckles, injuries I hadn't even noticed receiving during the confrontation. "What about the markings?" I asked before leaving. "The symbols carved into his skin?" Kerrigan's expression darkened. "We're looking into that. Preliminary examination suggests they're self-inflicted, some kind of ritual scarification. The coroner thinks they were created over a period of years. And the notebook? The names? That's part of an ongoing investigation," he said firmly. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Green, but that's all I can share at this time." They let me go with instructions not to leave the state until the investigation was complete. I checked into a motel on the edge of town, called my dispatcher to explain the delay in my delivery, and finally collapsed into unconsciousness. I slept through the day and into the evening, waking disoriented as darkness fell once more. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why. Then it all came flooding back. The pursuit, the confrontation, the impossible resilience of the man I'd shot. After a shower and a meal at the diner across the street, I returned to find Mercer waiting in the motel parking lot. "Hope I didn't alarm you," he said, seeing my expression. "Just thought you might want to know the coroner completed the preliminary autopsy." "And?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Cause of death was exactly what you'd expect. Multiple gunshot wounds," Mercer said. "But there were other findings. Marsh's body showed signs of severe malnutrition. He probably hadn't eaten properly in weeks, maybe months. And there was evidence of previous injuries that never received medical attention, broken bones that healed wrong, internal scarring." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the man should have been barely able to walk, let alone stalk you for miles." Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "The coroner can't explain how he was functioning at all in that condition, much less how he continued advancing after taking 5 bullets. I waited, sensing there was more. "There's something else," Mercer continued. "Those markings on his skin, they're not random. The FBI is sending someone to look at them, but our local expert thinks there's some kind of language or code." "What kind of code?" I asked. Mercer shrugged. "Above my pay grade, but whatever it is, it covered almost every inch of him. Some of the cuts were fresh, made within the last few days." We stood in silence for a moment, the implications hanging in the air between us. "Am I in danger?" I finally asked. "No reason to think so," Mercer said, but he didn't meet my eyes. "Marsh seems to have been acting alone, but—" He hesitated, then made a decision. "Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but that notebook, most of the names in it belong to people who traveled this highway. Truckers, salesmen, vacationers. Some we've been able to contact. They reported similar experiences, being followed, feeling watched. All of them managed to reach populated areas before anything happened. You're the first one who confronted him directly." "The names that were crossed out," I said quietly. "Did you contact those people too?" Mercer's silence was answer enough. "Get some rest, Mr. Green," he said finally. "You can pick up your rig tomorrow. The investigation is still ongoing, but no one's looking to charge you with anything. Self-defense is clear." After he left, I sat on the edge of the motel bed staring at the wall. The detective's words replayed in my mind, along with the image of Jeffrey Marsh advancing through a hail of bullets, his expression unchanged, those strange markings covering his skin. Most disturbing of all was the memory of that small, folded paper with my name written on it. How had he known who I was? What had made me his target? I didn't sleep again that night. 3 days after the incident at Starling Grain Elevator, I was back on the road. The investigation continued, but the authorities had no reason to keep me. My statement matched the physical evidence. Every law enforcement official I spoke with agreed. I'd acted in self-defense against a disturbed individual who had targeted me for unknown reasons. I delivered my original load 3 days late, but my company understood the circumstances. Then I took another assignment, this one heading east toward Chicago. I needed to work, needed the routine and familiarity of the highway stretching before me. But everything had changed. I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, tense at the sight of any vehicle maintaining a consistent distance behind me. I'd never been a nervous driver, but now every pickup truck on the road sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Marsh walking toward me, his body absorbing bullets that should have dropped him instantly. In my dreams, he didn't fall. In my dreams, he reached me. A week after leaving Nebraska, I received a call from Detective Kerrigan. The formal investigation had concluded. No charges would be filed against me. Jeffrey Marsh's body remained unclaimed. No family had come forward. "What about the notebook?" I asked. "The names?" Kerrigan sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "That's still ongoing. The FBI is involved now. I can't share details, but we've confirmed that several of the crossed-out names belong to people who went missing along that stretch of highway over the past decade. Cold cases, mostly. No bodies found." My grip tightened on the phone. "So he was what, a serial killer?" "We don't know," Kerrigan admitted. "The evidence suggests something stranger. Those markings on his body, they match symbols found at some of the disappearance sites, carved into trees, drawn in dirt, and the notebook contains entries that predate Marsh's known presence in the area." "What are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything officially," the detective replied carefully. "But off the record, whatever was happening out there might have been going on longer than one man's lifetime, and it might not be over." After we hung up, I pulled into a rest stop and sat in my idling truck, trying to process what I'd heard. The implication was clear. Marsh might have been part of something larger, something organized, or perhaps even more disturbing, something passed down, inherited. I reached into my pocket, touching the folded piece of paper I'd been carrying since leaving Nebraska. Not the original with my name, that remained in police evidence, but a similar scrap on which I'd copied the strange markings I remembered seeing on Marsh's skin. I'd been trying to reproduce them from memory, hoping they might provide some clue to what had happened. So far, they remained meaningless, curved lines and angular shapes that defied categorization. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were important, that they contained a message I needed to understand. 2 weeks after the incident, I was in a truck stop in Iowa when I overheard a conversation that froze me in place. 2 drivers at the next table, leaning in close, voices hushed but audible. "Following him for miles, same distance back, never trying to pass." "Highway 20?" the second driver asked. "No, further south. That stretch through Nebraska, the long, empty one." I turned in my seat, coffee forgotten. "Excuse me," I said, interrupting their conversation. "This following, when did it happen?" The first driver, a bearded man in his 50s, looked surprised at my intrusion but answered readily enough. "Couple days ago, friend of mine. Said it was the creepiest thing, this old station wagon keeping pace behind him for nearly 100 miles. "Did he see the driver?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Nah, windows were tinted dark. He pulled off at a rest stop, circled back, managed to lose them eventually." "Where exactly was this?" I pressed. The driver named the same stretch of highway where Marsh had followed me. "Why?" he asked, studying my face. "You had something similar happen?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. That night I called Detective Kerrigan again. He listened to my account of the trucker's conversation without interruption. "We'll look into it," he said finally. "But I should tell you, Mr. Green, we've had several reports like this since your incident. All of them checked out as ordinary vehicles with innocent explanations." You think I'm being paranoid, I said flatly. I think you went through a traumatic experience, Kerrigan replied carefully. It would be natural to see patterns that might not exist. But I knew what I'd heard. And more importantly, I knew what I'd experienced. Whatever Marsh had been, whoever he had been, it wasn't over. A month passed. I continued working, taking runs across the Midwest, deliberately avoiding Nebraska. The dreams persisted, but their grip loosened slightly with time. I started sleeping better, checking my mirrors less obsessively. Then came the package. It arrived at my home address during a rare weekend off, a small manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a newspaper clipping. The photograph showed Starling grain elevator taken from the highway at a distance. Nothing remarkable about it, except for the date stamp in the corner, 3 days ago. The newspaper clipping was from a small-town paper I didn't recognize. The headline read, "Local man reports being stalked on highway." The article described an incident virtually identical to mine. A driver followed for miles by a vehicle that maintained a consistent distance. When the driver confronted his pursuer at an abandoned gas station, the follower fled. The final line of the article sent ice through my veins. The driver was unable to identify the make of the vehicle, describing it only as an old pickup truck, possibly blue. I called Kerrigan immediately. He promised to send someone to collect the package, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "It could be someone who read about your case, playing a sick joke," he suggested. "Or it could be happening again," I countered. That night, I spread my notes across my kitchen table. Everything I'd gathered about Marsh and the incident. Newspaper articles, my own written account, the copied symbols. Looking at it all together, I began to see connections I'd missed before. The symbols I'd copied formed a pattern when arranged in a certain order. Not a language exactly, but a diagram of sorts. And at its center was a shape that matched the outline of Starling grain elevator perfectly. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marsh hadn't chosen that location randomly. He'd driven me there deliberately. The elevator wasn't just an abandoned building. It was significant somehow. Important to whatever purpose had driven him to follow me. I booked a week's vacation from work and packed my personal vehicle. The next morning, I headed west, back toward Nebraska, back toward the grain elevator. I told myself I was being foolish, chasing shadows. But I needed answers, needed to understand what had happened to me and why. The journey took 2 days. I avoided the highway where it had all begun, taking a parallel route instead. As I neared the county where the elevator stood, I called ahead to the sheriff's office asking for Deputy Mercer. "I'm surprised to hear from you, Mr. Green," he said when I explained my presence in the area. "Most people would be putting as much distance as possible between themselves and a place like that." "I need to understand what happened," I told him simply. Mercer agreed to meet me at a diner in the county seat. He looked more worn than I remembered, with new lines etched around his eyes. "The FBI investigation hit a wall," he told me over coffee. "Marsh's background is spotty at best. Spent time in various institutions in his youth, then disappeared from official records for long stretches. Would surface occasionally, minor offenses, psychiatric holds, then vanish again." "And the notebook?" I asked. "The names? They've identified most of them. 17 people who went missing over the past 30 years, all along that same stretch of highway. No bodies ever recovered." Mercer sipped his coffee. "But here's the strange part. The notebook also contained names of people who disappeared before Marsh was even born. How is that possible?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Mercer set down his cup. "The prevailing theory is that Marsh inherited the notebook, continued whatever sick project someone else started." "The markings on his body," I said. "Did they ever figure out what they meant?" "Not exactly." Mercer hesitated. "But they found similar markings at Starling grain elevator, hidden, carved into the concrete foundations. Carbon dating puts them at about 70 years old, when the elevator was first built." I told him my theory, that the elevator wasn't randomly chosen, that it held some significance to Marsh, or to whatever drove him. Mercer didn't dismiss the idea. "Place has a history," he admitted. "Bad accidents during construction, workers disappearing. Locals always said it was built wrong. built on the wrong spot. I need to see it again, I said. Mercer studied me for a long moment. I can't officially sanction this, you understand, but I can look the other way if you decide to visit. The property's abandoned. Technically public land now. The next day, I drove to Starling Grain Elevator. The facility looked different in daylight, less menacing, more pathetic. A concrete dinosaur slowly crumbling back into the earth. The yard where the confrontation had occurred was empty, the bloodstain long since washed away by rain. Yellow crime scene tape still fluttered from one corner, forgotten or deliberately left behind. I walked the perimeter of the complex, studying the buildings, comparing them to the diagram formed by the symbols I'd copied. The match wasn't perfect, but close enough to confirm my suspicion. The arrangement of structures followed the pattern of those carved markings. The main silo loomed above me, a concrete cylinder reaching toward the sky. Its entrance was padlocked, but the hasp was rusted, the wood around it rotted. A firm pull tore it free. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light, streaming through broken windows high above. The space was vast and hollow, sound echoing strangely. Graffiti covered the lower walls, names, dates, crude drawings, but higher up, above the reach of casual vandals, I could see older markings, carved directly into the concrete, weathered by time but still visible. The same symbols I'd seen on Marsh's body, the same pattern I'd been trying to decipher for weeks. I spent hours in that place, documenting everything with my phone's camera, copying down markings, measuring distances between structures. By the time the sun began to set, I had filled a notebook with observations and sketches. As I prepared to leave, a movement caught my eye, a flicker at the edge of the property, near the access road. I froze, peering through the gathering dusk. A vehicle was parked there, half hidden by the tall grass. Not Marsh's pickup. This was newer, a dark SUV with tinted windows. As I watched, it backed slowly away, then turned and drove off toward the highway. I considered pursuing it, but something held me back. Instead, I completed my documentation, locked my discoveries in my car's trunk, and headed back to town. That night in my motel room, I spread everything out again, adding my new findings to the existing materials. The pattern was clearer now, the connections more obvious. Starling Grain Elevator wasn't just a building. It was a marker of sorts, a monument with its own internal logic. The symbols formed a calendar, I realized. Not one based on days or months, but on cycles of some other kind. And according to that calendar, we were approaching another significant point, less than a week away. I called Mercer the next morning, sharing my discoveries. He listened without interruption, then asked to meet me at the sheriff's office. When I arrived, Detective Kerrigan was there as well, along with a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Special Agent Wilcox from the FBI. I laid out my findings for them, explaining the pattern I'd discovered and its implications. "You believe someone else has taken up Marsh's activities," Agent Wilcox said. It wasn't a question. "The reports of vehicles following drivers have continued," I pointed out, "and now there's a specific date approaching, according to the calendar these symbols create. 3 days from now," Mercer added, studying the diagram I'd created. "What exactly do you think is going to happen?" Kerrigan asked. I shook my head. "I don't know, but whatever Marsh was part of, whatever drove him to follow me and those others, it's still active, and it's centered on that elevator." They didn't dismiss me outright, which told me more than any words could have. They knew something, or suspected something, that aligned with my theories. "We'll increase patrols on that stretch of highway," Mercer said finally. "Keep an eye on the elevator, but Mr. Green, I strongly advise you to leave the area before this date you've identified." I nodded, agreed to their advice, thanked them for their time. But even as I spoke, I knew I wouldn't be leaving. Not yet. Not until I understood what had happened to me, and why. The next 2 days passed in a blur of research and preparation. I reviewed everything I'd gathered, looking for patterns I might have missed. I drove the highway where Marsh had followed me, trying to see it through his eyes, to understand what had made me a target. And I watched for followers. That dark SUV I'd glimpsed at the elevator, or any vehicle that maintained a too-perfect distance behind me. But nothing appeared. The roads remained ordinary, the traffic unremarkable. On the night before the date indicated by the symbols, I returned to Starling Grain Elevator. I parked some distance away, hiking in through the fields to avoid detection. The moon was nearly full, casting the abandoned complex in silver light and deep shadow. I found a position in one of the outbuildings with a clear view of the main yard, the same spot where Marsh had confronted me. Then I settled in to wait, camera ready, notebook open. Hours passed, midnight came and went. Nothing happened. No vehicles approached, no figures moved in the moonlight. The elevator stood silent and empty, just a relic of a bygone agricultural era. I was beginning to think I'd misinterpreted everything when I heard it. The distant sound of an engine, growing steadily louder. Headlights appeared on the access road, sweeping across the overgrown fields as a vehicle approached. Not one vehicle, 3. They entered the yard in formation, a dark SUV in the lead, followed by 2 pickup trucks. They parked in a semicircle, headlights illuminating the central area where Marsh had fallen. Figures emerged from the vehicles, 6 in total, all dressed in dark clothing. They moved with purpose, carrying objects I couldn't identify at first. As they arranged themselves in the yard, I realized they were setting up some kind of ceremony. A folding table was placed at the center. Candles were lit, their flames steady in the still night air. One of the figures, taller than the rest, thin to the point of gauntness, began unrolling something on the table. A map, I thought at first, but then recognized it as a large sheet covered in the same symbols I'd been studying. I raised my camera, zooming in as much as possible, capturing images of the proceedings. The group had formed a circle around the table now. The tall figure raised his arms, and the others followed suit. Though I couldn't hear their words clearly, I could see their lips moving in unison, a chant or prayer of some kind. The ceremony continued for nearly an hour, intricate and choreographed, with each participant taking turns approaching the table and adding something to it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The tall figure gathered the sheet, carefully folding it along precise lines. The candles were extinguished. The table collapsed and returned to one of the vehicles. Before departing, each person knelt briefly at the exact spot where Marsh had died, touching the ground with their fingertips. Then they returned to their vehicles and drove away, headlights fading into the distance. I remained hidden for another hour, making sure they were truly gone before emerging. When I finally approached the spot where their ceremony had taken place, I found only one item left behind, a small folded paper, identical to the one Marsh had carried. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. Inside was a name, written in the same spidery handwriting I remembered. Not my name this time, a different one, unfamiliar to me, the next target. I gathered my evidence and left the elevator for the last time, driving straight to the sheriff's office. Though it was nearly dawn, I called Mercer's cell phone from the parking lot. He arrived 20 minutes later, bleary-eyed but alert. I showed him the photographs I'd taken, described the ceremony I'd witnessed, and gave him the folded paper with its ominous name. He recognized it immediately. A long-haul trucker who regularly used the highway, scheduled to pass through in 2 days' time. "We'll intercept him, warn him," Mercer said, already reaching for his phone. "And these people you saw, we can identify their vehicles, track them down." "I don't think it's that simple," I said quietly. "Marsh was just one part of this. These people, whoever they are, they've been doing this for generations, and they'll keep doing it, with or without those specific vehicles, those specific individuals." Mercer didn't argue. We both knew I was right. In the following weeks, a task force was formed, local law enforcement working with the FBI, focusing on the highway and the grain elevator. They monitored traffic patterns, investigated the ownership history of the property, tracked down former workers who had been there when the elevator was operational. I provided everything I had gathered, every observation and theory. Then I went home, back to my life, back to my roots, though I made sure they never took me anywhere near that stretch of Nebraska again. Sometimes I wonder if we've stopped it, if the investigation disrupted whatever cycle had been in operation for all those decades. Other times, I'm certain it continues, just moved to a different location, adapted to avoid detection. I still keep my notes, Still update them when new information emerges. Still check the missing persons reports from the Midwest, looking for patterns others might miss. And I never drive at night without checking my mirrors, watching for vehicles that maintain that perfect, unvarying distance. Because out there on the long highways that stretch across America's empty spaces, something is hunting. Something that knows your name before you ever see it coming. Something patient enough to follow you for miles, for hours, until you make that fatal mistake of stopping in the wrong place, confronting what should not be confronted. I survived my encounter. Others weren't so fortunate. And somewhere, on some isolated stretch of asphalt, the pursuit continues. So if you're driving alone at night, and you notice a vehicle behind you, not too close, not too far, just there, steady and constant for mile after empty mile, don't stop. Don't confront it. Just keep driving until you reach lights and people and safety. Because some things, once they start following you, never really stop. My grandmother called me Makya, one who hunts, long before I ever considered a career in the wilderness. The name felt prophetic when I accepted the position as a park ranger at Glacier National Park. I needed the isolation after what happened in the city. Most people run to urban areas to lose themselves, but for me, it was the opposite. The sprawl of concrete and noise had become suffocating, especially after losing both my parents to a house fire I couldn't prevent. The position was advertised as remote backcountry ranger, stationed at the Whispering Pines Outpost, a forgotten corner of the park where visitors rarely ventured. The job listing had sat unfilled for nearly a year. When I interviewed, the district supervisor, a weathered man named Harmon, seemed almost desperate to place someone there before winter. The last ranger left suddenly, he explained, his eyes avoiding mine. Said the place was too isolated, started hearing things. Happens when you've been alone too long. I took that as a good sign. Isolation was exactly what I wanted. The cabin stood nestled between ancient pines on the edge of a still dark lake called Mirror Waters. It was simple. One bedroom, a small kitchenette, a living area with a potbelly stove, and a cramped bathroom. Solar panels provided limited electricity, and satellite communications were temperamental at best. My nearest neighbor was a ranger outpost over 20 miles away. On my first evening, I stood on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the jagged mountains. The air held the crisp bite of approaching winter, though it was only early October. As darkness fell, I noticed something peculiar. The forest went completely silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling animals, no wind through the pines, just absolute stillness. That was when I heard it for the first time, a distant, plaintive cry that seemed to come from across the lake. It sounded almost human, but stretched and warped, like someone had recorded a scream and played it back at half speed. I grabbed my flashlight and swept its beam across the water. Nothing, just the perfect reflection of stars on the surface. I chalked it up to a wounded animal or the wind playing tricks and went inside. That night I dreamed of running through a frozen forest, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel at my heels, something ravenous. The next morning I familiarized myself with my patrol area. Harmon had assigned me to monitor nearly 30 square miles of backcountry, checking trail conditions, documenting wildlife sightings, and assisting the rare hikers who ventured this far into the wilderness. Most of my work would be solitary. 3 days into my posting, I found my first anomaly. While patrolling a remote trail, I discovered strange tracks in a muddy section. They looked almost like deer prints, but elongated and deeper, as if the creature had been walking on 2 legs. I photographed them with my phone and continued, uneasy. A mile further, I found scraps of fabric caught on a thorny bush. The fabric was fresh, a bright blue synthetic material from modern outdoor clothing. Searching the area, I discovered a single hiking boot lying on its side, the laces still tied. I radioed the situation to headquarters. Possible lost hiker near Blackwater Ridge Trail. Found abandoned gear, no sign of the individual. Copy that, came the response. Are there any indications of animal activity, bear or mountain lion? I scanned the ground again. Negative, no blood, no animal tracks. I hesitated. Just some unusual footprints I can't identify. There was a long pause. Document everything and return to your station. Weather's turning bad. We'll send a search team tomorrow if conditions allow. The sky had indeed darkened, heavy clouds rolling in with unnatural speed. I felt the temperature dropping as I hurried back toward my cabin. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees creaking as the wind picked up. That evening, a storm lashed against the cabin. Rain pounded the roof while wind howled through the pines like voices calling my name. I sat by the fire, reviewing the patrol handbook and cross-referencing the strange tracks I'd found. Nothing matched. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I jolted awake to the sound of scratching at my door. Slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. I grabbed my flashlight and sidearm, cautiously approaching the entrance. "Park Ranger," I called out. "Identify yourself." The scratching stopped. Silence followed, broken only by the pattering of rain. I waited, counting my heartbeats, before finally working up the courage to open the door. The porch was empty, but in the mud before the steps, illuminated by my flashlight beam, was a perfect set of those strange, elongated tracks, leading directly to my door before disappearing back into the forest. I slammed the door shut and double-checked the locks. Sleep didn't come again that night. The next morning, the tracks were gone, washed away by the rain. I began to doubt my own memory until I found deep scratches in the wooden door, too high for any normal animal to reach. The search team never arrived. Headquarters radioed that a bridge had washed out in the storm, making the access road impassable. They estimated at least a week before repairs would allow them through. "Anyone else reported missing hikers?" I asked. The pause was longer this time. "Actually, yes. 3 separate reports in the past month, all in your sector. We assumed they were just off-trail or missed check-ins." 3 people missing? And you didn't think to mention it during my orientation? "Look," the voice crackled through static. "These things happen in remote areas. People get lost, underestimate the wilderness, nothing unusual." But there was something in his tone, a forced casualness that made my skin crawl. They knew something they weren't telling me. That night I heard the cry again, closer this time, somewhere in the woods behind my cabin. I stood on the porch peering into the darkness when my eyes caught movement at the forest's edge. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, stood motionless between 2 ancient pines. Though I couldn't make out details in the darkness, I could feel it watching me. I raised my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, the figure retreated, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait into the deeper woods. Sleep became my enemy that night, delivering fragmented nightmares of emaciated figures with 2 long limbs chasing me through endless forests, always culminating with the sensation of icy breath on the back of my neck. I woke to the realization that winter had arrived overnight. Snow dusted the ground around my cabin, and the lake had begun to freeze at its edges. Too early for this weather, even for Glacier. Something was wrong with this place. Something had been wrong long before I arrived. The first real snowfall came a week later, blanketing the forest in white silence. The storm knocked out my satellite communications, leaving me completely isolated. According to protocol, I should wait 3 days before attempting the journey to the nearest ranger station if communications couldn't be restored. I spent those days reviewing previous rangers' logbooks I'd found in a dusty drawer. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, wildlife sightings, trail maintenance. But entries from the previous ranger, a man named Rivera, grew increasingly erratic toward the end. October 15th. Found another abandoned campsite today. Tent still standing, equipment inside, food half prepared. No signs of struggle, no tracks. Where are these people going? October 19th. The sounds at night are getting worse, not animals, something else. October 23rd. Saw it today, standing at the lake edge, too tall, too thin, watching me. Need to get out. The final entry simply read, "It knows I'm alone." The date was October 28th, exactly 1 year ago to the day I found myself reading it. That night, the temperature plummeted to well below freezing. I stoked the fire and huddled close, trying to ignore the persistent scratching sounds from the cabin roof. Raccoons, I told myself, just raccoons or pine branches. At midnight, my radio crackled to life. Through waves of static, I heard a voice, faint but clear enough to make out words. Help! Lost! By the lake! So cold. I grabbed the radio. This is Ranger Makia at Whispering Pines Outpost. Identify yourself and your location. No response, just more static. Then, please, near the big rock, hurry. I knew the formation, a large boulder on the opposite shoreline, about a mile around the lake. If someone was stranded there in this cold, they wouldn't survive the night. I geared up quickly. Heavy coat, gloves, boots, headlamp. Standard rescue pack with first aid supplies, emergency blankets, water, and energy bars. My sidearm holstered at my hip. I hesitated at the door, remembering Rivera's final warning, then stepped out into the bitter night. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I followed the shoreline. My breath clouded before me, and the beam of my headlamp created a tunnel of visibility in the absolute darkness. The forest loomed to my right, the frozen lake to my left. Halfway to the rock, I noticed the tracks, those same elongated, deer-like prints, but now they seemed to walk on two legs with an uneven gait. They paralleled my path along the shore, keeping to the tree line. I called out, "Hello, Park Ranger, is anyone there?" My voice echoed across the lake, then died in the snow-muffled forest. No response. The radio at my belt crackled again. "Hurry, hungry, so hungry." Something about the voice changed, a subtle shift in tone that raised the hairs on my neck. I slowed my pace, scanning the tree line more carefully. The tracks had vanished. When I reached the boulder, there was no one there. No signs of a campsite, no equipment, no human presence at all. Just pristine snow and silence. Then I noticed something carved into the rock face, fresh marks that hadn't been weathered by time. Crude symbols that resembled a stick figure with elongated limbs and antlers or branches extending from its head. Below it were words carved in jagged letters, Wendigo hungers. I knew the legend, the Algonquin myth of humans transformed by cannibalism into insatiable skeletal creatures doomed to roam the winter forests in eternal hunger. A ridiculous superstition, I told myself, a prank by locals perhaps. That's when I noticed the silence. Complete absence of sound, no wind, no animals, not even the creak of frozen branches. Then, a snapping twig behind me. I whirled around, hand moving to my sidearm. At the forest's edge stood a figure, tall and gaunt, partially hidden behind a tree. I could make out impossibly long, thin limbs and what appeared to be antlers or branches protruding from its head. "Park Service," I called, my voice steadier than I felt. "Identify yourself." The figure didn't move, but I heard a sound like chattering teeth or bones knocking together. I drew my weapon. "This is your final warning." The figure stepped partially into the moonlight. Its skin was pulled tight over an emaciated frame, appearing gray and mottled in the dim light. Its face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the lake, and when my eyes readjusted, the figure was gone. My radio burst to life with the same voice, now distorted and clearly inhuman. "Ranger, so hungry, come feed us." I ran, back along the shore, my headlamp bouncing wildly, illuminating glimpses of movement through the trees pacing me. Always just at the edge of visibility, always keeping pace. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door and barricaded it with everything I could move. Through the windows, I watched the tree line, glimpsing shadows moving between the pines until dawn finally broke. In the morning light, I examined the area around my cabin. A circle of those same tracks surrounded the building, as if something had paced around it all night, looking for a way in. But most disturbing was what I found on my porch. A pile of bones, picked clean and arranged in a careful pattern. Human finger bones. I tried the satellite phone again. This time, it connected. "This is Whispering Pines Outpost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need immediate extraction." "Whispering Pines? That you, Makia?" It was Harmon, the supervisor. "What's the situation?" "There's something out here. Something hunting people. I found human remains." "Calm down," he interrupted. "Probably just animal activity. Bears sometimes." "This isn't bears," I snapped. "I found tracks, heard voices. I saw—" I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. I think there's a Wendigo. The line went silent for so long I thought I'd lost the connection. Finally, Harmon spoke, his voice lower. Listen carefully. Don't use that word. Don't even think it. There have been incidents in that area going back decades. People disappearing. Rangers requesting transfers. We thought it had gone dormant. You knew? My hand tightened around the phone. You sent me out here knowing something was wrong? We didn't think it would wake up again, he said quietly. It usually hibernates for decades between cycles. The last activity was in the 80s. Get me out of here. Now. We can't. The access roads are completely snowed in after last night's storm. Earliest we could reach you is 5 days, and that's if the weather holds. I looked out the window at the pristine white landscape. Beautiful. Deadly. What am I supposed to do for 5 days? Stay inside after dark. Keep fires burning. And whatever you do, don't listen if it calls to you using familiar voices. That night, as darkness fell, I heard voices calling from the woods. My mother's voice, my father's voice, asking for help, saying they were cold and lost. I put in earplugs and curled up by the fire, clutching my sidearm, watching the windows as shadows moved outside. 5 days suddenly seemed like an eternity. Dawn brought temporary reprieve. The shadows retreated, and I used the daylight hours to further fortify my position. I nailed boards across the windows, leaving only narrow gaps to peer through. I gathered additional firewood, keeping the stove roaring against the unnatural cold that had descended on the area. I returned to Rivera's logbooks, searching for insights from previous rangers. Most of the journals were mundane, but in a box beneath the floorboards of the bedroom closet, I discovered something more valuable, a journal dating back to 1937, written by a ranger named Joseph Blackwater. Blackwater had been stationed here during another unusually early winter. His handwriting grew increasingly frantic as the journal progressed. November 12, 1937. The local Blackfeet refused to enter this valley during winter. Elder Morning Sky told me stories today of the Wendigo, a creature born of human greed and hunger. When a person consumes the flesh of another human out of desperation, she said, something ancient and evil enters them, transforming them into a creature of insatiable hunger. November 15, 1937. Found the remains of the missing hikers today, not eaten by animals as we thought. The bodies were partially consumed, only certain parts taken. The rest arranged in patterns I cannot decipher. November 20th, 1937. It watches from the tree line. I've seen it 3 nights in a row, growing bolder. Elder Morning Sky gave me a pouch of herbs and instructions for a protective circle. Says it cannot cross certain boundaries. The final pages contained detailed notes on Wendigo lore, weaknesses, behaviors, and rituals of protection. Blackwater had consulted with tribal elders and documented everything. According to his notes, Wendigos were once human, but transformed by an ancient spirit after committing cannibalism. They could mimic human voices to lure prey. They grew stronger with each victim consumed. But most importantly, they could be warded off with specific totems and herbs. I spent the day gathering what I could find based on Blackwater's instructions: red cedar, sage, tobacco from my own supplies. I created small bundles and placed them at each window and doorway. It felt ridiculous, like playing at witchcraft, but I was beyond skepticism. By mid-afternoon, a new storm moved in, bringing swirling snow and dropping visibility to mere feet beyond my porch. The wind carried sounds that might have been howling weather, or might have been something else entirely. At sunset, my satellite phone rang, unexpected, as I hadn't been able to get a signal all day. I answered cautiously. Makya, it's Harmon. Good news. Road's clear sooner than expected. Rescue team is about 2 miles from your location. Should reach you within the hour. Relief flooded through me. Thank God. I'll be ready. Just sit tight. They'll identify themselves with 3 short whistle blasts. I packed my essential belongings, keeping my weapon close. As darkness settled completely, I heard it. 3 short whistle blasts from the direction of the access road. I peered through the window slot. Flashlight beams bounced between trees, coming closer. Human voices called my name. Something felt wrong. The road shouldn't be cleared this quickly after such heavy snowfall. And Harmon hadn't asked about my well-being or the situation. uncharacteristic for a man known for his thoroughness. I checked Blackwater's journal again, finding a passage I'd overlooked. The creature's greatest power is deception. It will use any means to lure its prey into the open. Voices of loved ones, promises of rescue. Trust nothing after dark. I doused my lights and waited silently. The flashlight beams reached my clearing, and I could make out 4 figures approaching the cabin. Their movements seemed off, slightly too fluid, their limbs swinging at odd angles. "Ranger Makia," one called in a perfect imitation of Harmon's voice. "We're here to extract you. Please come out." I remained silent, watching through the narrow window slot. The figures conferred among themselves, then spread out around my cabin. One approached the porch, its flashlight beam sweeping the windows. For a moment the light illuminated its face, a disturbing approximation of human features stretched over an inhuman skull, with eyes like empty pits. I recoiled from the window, pressing my back against the wall, listening to footsteps on the porch. "We know you're in there," came the voice, no longer perfectly human, the syllables stretching unnaturally. "So hungry. Let us in." Scratching began at each window and door simultaneously, methodical, testing for weaknesses. I noticed with horrified fascination that wherever the scratching encountered one of my herbal bundles, it would pause, then move elsewhere. For hours they circled and probed, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming in the voices of people I knew. My parents begged me to open the door. Old colleagues pleaded for shelter from the cold. Near midnight, the attack intensified. Something heavy slammed repeatedly against the door. Claws or hands scraped at the roof, seeking entry through the chimney until they encountered the smoke and herbs I'd fed into the fire. Then, abruptly, silence fell. I crept to the window and peered out. The clearing was empty, but at the forest's edge stood a single figure, taller than the others, with a crown of antlers that reached toward the clouded sky. It remained perfectly still, watching the cabin, watching me. As if sensing my gaze, it raised an impossibly long arm and pointed directly at my window. The message was clear. This wasn't over. I spent the remaining hours of darkness reinforcing my defenses and studying Blackwater's journal. According to his notes, Wendigos were territorial creatures, usually solitary. The presence of multiple entities suggested something far worse than a normal infestation. A hunting pack, growing in number with each victim. Morning brought another discovery. Fresh tracks leading to and from my cabin, but also a dead radio battery. My satellite phone showed no signal. I was truly isolated now, with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. I turned again to Blackwater's journal, looking for anything that might help me survive. The final pages described a confrontation. December 3rd, 1937. Elder Morning Sky says there is only one way to destroy a Wendigo. Fire purifies, but the heart must be removed and burned separately. The risk is great. If one fails, the hunter becomes the next vessel. December 5th, 1937. I have prepared everything according to the elder's instructions. The protective circle is complete. Tonight, I will draw it out with fire and end this. The journal ended there. I never found out if Blackwater succeeded, but the fact that the journal remained in the cabin suggested he might not have returned from his confrontation. That afternoon, I spotted a figure at the lake's edge, a stooped, elderly Native American woman watching my cabin. When I blinked, she was gone. A hallucination from stress and lack of sleep, I told myself, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that Morning Sky had somehow reached across time to observe this new cycle of an ancient pattern. The storm intensified as darkness approached. I had 3 days remaining until the real rescue team could reach me, if they could reach me at all. 3 more nights to survive against creatures that grew bolder with each encounter. I checked my ammunition, reinforced my wards, and prepared for another night of siege as the sun descended and the whispering began once more from the darkened woods. By the 3rd night, exhaustion had worn me down to a raw bundle of nerves. Sleep came only in brief, scattered moments, invariably interrupted by scratching or voices from outside. My food supplies dwindled. I'd packed for a standard 2-week rotation, not a siege. The satellite phone remained dead, despite my attempts to recharge it using the solar backup, which was rendered useless by the perpetual cloud cover. I'd mapped the patterns of their attacks. They began at sunset with distant calls, progressed to circling the cabin after full darkness, and culminated in direct assaults around midnight. By 3 a.m., they typically retreated to the forest, though the tall, antlered one, which I'd come to think of as the alpha, always remained visible at the tree line until dawn. This night would be different. I could sense it in the unnatural stillness that preceded sunset, in the heavy pressure of the air, in the complete absence of natural sounds from the forest. They were gathering strength for something significant. I made final preparations according to Blackwater's journal. I created a circle of the remaining herbs in the center of the cabin's main room, a last refuge if the outer defenses failed. I positioned containers of kerosene strategically, a desperate measure if all else failed, and I kept Rivera's shotgun loaded and within reach, though Blackwater's notes suggested conventional weapons would only slow the creatures, not destroy them. As the last light faded, I heard something new, a rhythmic pounding, like multiple sets of hands beating on hollow logs. It came from all directions, surrounding the cabin in percussive waves that seemed to penetrate my bones. Through my observation slots, I watched them emerge from the forest. Not 4 this time, but at least a dozen gaunt figures with elongated limbs and emaciated bodies. They formed a circle around my cabin, swaying to their percussion. Behind them, the alpha watched from the tree line, its antlered head silhouetted against the snow. "What do you want?" I shouted, immediately regretting revealing my position. The drumming stopped. One figure stepped forward, more human-looking than the others, wearing tattered ranger clothing. With a jolt of recognition, I realized it was Rivera, the previous ranger. His face was gaunt, skin pulled tight over protruding bones, eyes sunken and dark. "Hunger," Rivera's voice croaked, sounding parched and hollow. "The hunger never stops. Join us, Makia. We'll feast together this winter." "How do you know my name?" I demanded. Rivera's mouth stretched into an approximation of a smile, revealing teeth filed to points. "We know all who enter our hunting grounds. We've been watching you, learning your weaknesses." "You were human once," I said, remembering Blackwater's notes. "You can fight this." Something flickered in Rivera's eyes, a momentary flash of awareness quickly consumed by darkness. "There is only hunger now," he whispered, then louder, "Let us in." The percussion resumed, faster and more frenzied. The figures began circling the cabin, their movements jerky and inhuman. 3 broke from the circle and charged the front door, slamming against it with unnatural strength. The wood splintered but held. Others attacked the barricaded windows, clawing at the boards. One reached the roof and began tearing at the shingles. I fired a shotgun blast through a gap in the window boards, hitting one creature squarely in the chest. It stumbled backward but didn't fall, the wound closing as I watched in horror. The assault intensified. Something large struck the chimney, partially collapsing it and sending smoke billowing into the cabin. I retreated to my herb circle, coughing, eyes streaming. Through the smoke, I saw boards being pried from a window, long gray fingers curling around the edges. I fired again, forcing them back momentarily. But I was running out of ammunition, and they were breaching multiple entry points simultaneously. In desperation, I knocked over one of the kerosene containers and ignited it with my emergency flare. Fire spread quickly across the wooden floor toward the compromised window. The creatures recoiled from the flames, shrieking in voices that were no longer remotely human. I retreated to the bedroom, barricading the door behind me. Through the window, I could see the main cabin was now engulfed in flames. The fire wouldn't last long before consuming the entire structure, and me with it. I had minutes at most to escape. The bedroom window was my only option. It faced the lake, away from where most creatures were concentrated. I shattered the glass with my rifle butt and cleared the shards. Cold air rushed in, momentarily clearing my lungs of smoke. I peered out, 20 feet of open ground to the forest, then a path that would lead to the lake. If I could reach the boathouse, I might find a canoe to escape across the water. A crash from the main room told me the front door had finally given way. Smoke poured under the bedroom door, accompanied by inhuman shrieks and the sizzling sound of flesh meeting flame. No more time. I climbed through the window, landing hard in the snow. I sprinted toward the tree line, not daring to look back even as I heard the wet pounding of feet in pursuit. The forest closed around me. I navigated by moonlight, following the faint path toward the lake. Behind me, my cabin burned, illuminating the night sky with orange light. The pursuing footsteps faded, then ceased entirely. The Wendigos were afraid of fire, at least temporarily. I reached the lakefront and found the small boathouse unlocked. Inside was a single aluminum canoe, dusty but intact. I dragged it to the water's edge, where thin ice had formed around the shoreline. Breaking through it with an oar, I pushed off into the dark waters. The lake was mirror still, reflecting the burning cabin in the distance. I paddled furiously, heading for the opposite shore where a fire road might eventually lead me to safety. Halfway across, I paused to catch my breath and assess my situation. That's when I saw them. Dark shapes moving along both shorelines, pacing my progress. They were hurting me, I realized with a sinking feeling, deliberately driving me toward the opposite shore. I changed direction, aiming for a small island near the lake's center. As I approached, I made out a structure, an old hunting blind or bird-watching station, long abandoned but still standing. It would provide temporary shelter at least. I beached the canoe and scrambled onto the rocky island, perhaps 50 yards across. The blind stood at its highest point, a simple wooden structure with viewing slits on all sides. Perfect for my purposes. I could see in every direction. Hauling myself inside, I collapsed on the dusty floor, lungs burning from exertion and smoke inhalation. Through the viewing slits, I watched the shores. Dark figures lined both sides now, dozens of them, more than I'd seen before. Among them stood the Alpha, its antlered head unmistakable, even at this distance. They were waiting, patient, hungry. As the adrenaline faded, bitter cold set in. I had escaped the immediate threat only to face a new one, exposure. Without shelter or fire, I wouldn't survive the night in these temperatures. In the distance, my cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks. The island was beyond the creature's reach, but they had only to wait. Hunger was their essence, but patience was their weapon. Dawn was hours away, and with it, perhaps my last chance for escape. The cold penetrated my bones as I huddled in the blind, watching the shorelines through narrowed eyes. The Wendigos remained visible throughout the night, their gaunt forms occasionally shifting position but never leaving. I counted over 20 distinct figures now, a hunting pack far larger than anything Blackwater had documented. My thoughts grew sluggish as hypothermia set in. I forced myself to move, doing jumping jacks and push-ups in the confined space, anything to generate body heat. It helped, but each wave of warmth was temporary, eventually surrendering to the relentless cold. Near dawn, I noticed something strange. The creatures were retreating from the shoreline, moving back into the forest. The Alpha remained longest, its antlered silhouette clearly visible against the lightening sky before it too melted into the trees. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, I assessed my situation. My cabin was gone. Nothing remained but a smoking ruin. With it, I'd lost all my supplies, communications, and shelter. The island provided temporary safety, but I couldn't remain here indefinitely. The eastern shore was closer to the park boundaries and ranger stations beyond. If I could reach it and follow the fire road south, I might encounter a patrol or make it to the highway. I launched the canoe into the still waters, every muscle protesting after the night's ordeal. The lake was partially frozen now, thin sheets of ice breaking beneath my paddle. The opposite shore seemed impossibly distant. Halfway across, movement caught my eye, not at the shoreline where I expected it, but in the water itself. Something dark moved beneath the surface, pacing my canoe. I paddled faster, heart racing. The water bulged 20 feet away, then rose as a figure emerged, humanoid but wrong, with elongated limbs and gray skin stretched tight over protruding bones. It moved through the water with unnatural speed, closing the distance rapidly. I swung my paddle like a weapon, connecting with its skull as it reached for the canoe. The impact reverberated up my arms. The creature sank momentarily, then resurfaced, a grotesque parody of a smile revealing needle-like teeth. More disturbances appeared in the water around me, 3, then 5 separate entities converging on my position. In desperation, I fired my remaining shotgun shells into the water. Dark fluid bloomed beneath the surface, but the pursuit continued. The shore was still 100 yards away when gray hands grasped the canoe's edge. I struck at them with the paddle, breaking fingers that immediately began to reform. The canoe tipped dangerously as more weight pressed against it. 50 yards from shore, the canoe capsized. The shock of the freezing water drove the air from my lungs. I thrashed toward the surface, breaking through to gasp a desperate breath. All around me, dark shapes moved through the water. Hands grabbed at my legs, pulling me down. I kicked free and swam with every ounce of remaining strength. My waterlogged clothing weighed me down, but I didn't dare release my grip on the shotgun, empty now but still a potential weapon. Something clamped around my ankle, dragging me under. In the murky water, I made out Rivera's face, transformed and inhuman but still recognizable. His eyes held no humanity, only endless hunger. I struck him with the shotgun butt, connecting with his temple. His grip loosened momentarily, enough for me to break free and resurface. The shore was tantalizingly close now. My feet touched bottom in the shallows. I staggered forward, falling and rising repeatedly, each step carrying me closer to land. Behind me, splashing sounds indicated my pursuers were following. I collapsed on the rocky shore, gasping and shivering violently. 20 yards away stood the tree line and the fire road beyond. If I could reach it. I forced myself to my feet, stumbling toward the trees. The Wendigos were emerging from the water now, moving with that unnatural, jerky gait. They were slower in daylight, I realized. Weakened, but not incapacitated. I reached the tree line and found the fire road, little more than a dirt track, but leading south toward civilization. I began running, each breath burning in my frozen lungs. Behind me, I heard them following, their footsteps a syncopated rhythm against the forest floor. Hours blurred together as I ran, walked, stumbled southward. The sun climbed higher, offering meager warmth. My wet clothes began to stiffen with ice. Hypothermia would claim me long before I reached safety if I couldn't find shelter and heat. Around midday, I spotted a trail marker indicating a ranger emergency shelter 2 miles ahead. New energy surged through me. These shelters were stocked with supplies, possibly communication equipment. The creatures had fallen behind, visible only occasionally through the trees. But they continued to follow. They were herding me again, I realized. But to what end? When I finally reached the emergency shelter, a small, sturdy cabin built into a hillside, I understood their strategy. The door hung open, splintered at the hinges. Inside, supplies were scattered and destroyed. The radio had been smashed, first aid kits emptied, emergency blankets shredded. They had methodically eliminated all possible refuge, all means of communication. How long had they been planning this? How many others had they hunted this way? I salvaged what I could, a half-empty bottle of water, a few energy bars, a box of matches. Not enough, but better than nothing. The shelter couldn't be secured with the door destroyed, so remaining was not an option. As I prepared to continue southward, I noticed something carved into the wooden wall, the same symbol I'd seen on the boulder, the stick figure with antlers. Below it, freshly carved, Wendigo sees you. Outside, the light was already fading. Another night was approaching, and with it, their full strength would return. I had perhaps 2 hours before sunset. The map on the shelter wall indicated the main highway was still 15 miles south, impossible to reach before dark. But there was another option, an old fire lookout tower just 3 miles east. Elevated and enclosed, it might provide better protection than this compromised shelter. I set out immediately, pushing my exhausted body beyond its limits. The forest grew darker as clouds rolled in, heavy with the promise of more snow. The temperature dropped steadily. When I finally spotted the lookout tower silhouetted against the darkening sky, tears of relief sprang to my eyes. The metal structure rose 60 feet above the treetops, accessible by a single staircase winding around its exterior. I reached the base as the first snowflakes began to fall. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, but held as I climbed, constantly scanning the forest below. Movement flickered between trees. They had found me again. The lookout cabin at the top was secured with a padlock, but I shattered it with a rock from my pocket. Inside was dusty but intact, a small stove, fuel, emergency provisions, and most importantly, a radio. I barricaded the door and lit the stove, huddling near its growing warmth. Outside, darkness fell completely as the storm intensified. Through frosted windows, I watched shadows moving at the base of the tower. They began climbing the stairs, metal groaning beneath their weight. I tried the radio, scanning frequencies, calling for help. Static answered until I hit the emergency channel. "This is Ranger Makia at Whispering Pines Sector, requesting immediate evacuation from Fire Lookout Tower 7. Under attack, multiple hostile entities. Does anyone copy?" A moment of static, then, "Makia, this is Harmon. What's your situation?" His voice was clearer than should be possible given the storm. I hesitated, remembering the false rescue attempt. "Verify your identity. Tell me something only the real Harmon would know." A pause. "When you interviewed, you had a coffee stain on your left sleeve. You said it happened because a squirrel startled you in the parking lot." Relief flooded through me. That detail was too specific to be mimicked. "I need extraction," I said urgently. "My cabin's gone. I'm at the lookout tower with multiple Wendigos trying to reach me." "Christ," Harmon muttered. "We've had search teams looking since your cabin fire was spotted. Storms grounded our helicopters, but we have rangers approaching your position by ground. ETA 3 hours. Can you hold out?" Below, the creatures had reached the halfway point on the stairs. The metal structure groaned ominously. "The tower won't last that long," I said. "They're breaking through." "Listen carefully," Harmon said, his voice tense. "After Blackwater disappeared in 37, we found notes he'd left with tribal elders. The Wendigos have a weakness. They're territorial and hierarchical. Kill the alpha and the others will scatter, at least temporarily." "How do I identify the alpha?" "Largest, usually with antler-like protrusions. According to the notes, it must be destroyed by fire, and its heart removed and burned separately." A tremendous crash shook the tower. They had reached the platform below the cabin and were testing the floor hatch. "They're here," I whispered. "Hold as long as you can," Harmon urged. "Help is coming." The radio went silent as the first board splintered in the floor. Long gray fingers pushed through the opening, grasping blindly. I had no more ammunition, no real weapons beyond the tools in the lookout. I grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and loaded it with shaking hands. Through the windows, I spotted the alpha standing at the base of the tower, watching. It hadn't climbed with the others. Instead, it circled the foundation, examining the structure's supports. With horrible clarity, I understood its plan. The supports were metal but bolted to concrete footings. If enough bolts were removed, I threw open the window and fired the flare directly at the alpha. The red light streaked through the night, illuminating falling snow in crimson light. It struck the creature's chest, igniting its desiccated flesh. It shrieked, a sound so primal and agonized it froze my blood. The burning alpha staggered, then fell against one of the tower supports. The metal groaned. Other Wendigos abandoned their assault on my position, descending to their leader's aid. The tower lurched sickeningly. One support had given way. The entire structure began to lean gradually southward as metal stressed beyond its tolerances. I had minutes at most before collapse. Grabbing the radio and emergency pack, I forced open the north-facing door, now tilted upward as the tower leaned south. The ground was 50 feet below, covered in deep snow. Survivable, perhaps, but I'd be surrounded immediately. I looked back through the windows. The alpha still burned, its followers circling in frantic patterns. They were distracted, disorganized without their leader's direction. This might be my only chance. I took a deep breath and leapt from the doorway, landing in a deep snowdrift. The impact drove the air from my lungs, but nothing felt broken. I struggled to my feet just as the tower collapsed behind me with a thunderous crash. The noise would draw them quickly. I ran into the forest, away from the fire and destruction, guided only by moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. For hours I pushed onward, expecting pursuit with every step. But none came. The forest remained silent except for the whisper of falling snow. Near dawn, I encountered headlights on the forest road, a Park Service vehicle on patrol. The search team Harmon had sent. As they rushed me to a heated vehicle and medical attention, I looked back toward the distant glow where the lookout tower still burned. Silhouetted against the flames stood a single figure, watching from the tree line. Impossibly tall and thin, its antlered head unmistakable even at this distance. It had survived. Months have passed since my rescue. I've recovered physically, though the nightmares persist. I requested transfer to a desert park, as far from northern forests as possible. The official report lists the incident as a wildfire and structural collapse due to winter storms. My encounter with the Wendigos appears only as possible hallucinations due to hypothermia and stress. But I know what I saw. I know what hunts in those remote woods. Sometimes at night I still hear scratching at my door, and when winter comes, I feel the hunger watching me from just beyond the light.